They say curiosity killed the cat, but in the ancient world, it was the beauty of women that brought down angels. Forget what you were told about apples and serpents. The real original sin didn't occur in Eden. It happened on the summit of Mount Hermon when 200 perfect beings decided that a human woman was worth more than paradise itself. More precious than the celestial realm they were sworn to protect. More tempting than the divine grace they had always known. The story you are about to hear won't be found in any conventional Bible. It was erased, censored, condemned to oblivion. But for centuries, it circulated in forbidden manuscripts, in hidden parchments, in desert caves, in translations copied in secret by trembling scribes, their quills scratching frantically in the dead of night. The kind of story whispered in hushed tones, passed from one generation to the next, always under the shadow of discovery. A story that challenges the very foundations of accepted truth. It's called the Book of Enoch, and what it recounts is so disturbing that religious authorities decided it was best if no one ever read it. Because this isn't a tale of abstract disobedience or forbidden fruit. It's a story of obsession, of desire, of how love can destroy not only the lover, but the entire world. A cautionary tale, echoing through the ages, warning against the dangers of unchecked longing. Imagine heaven before the fall, not as a place of clouds and harps, but as a dimension of pure light, where beings of fire and crystal fulfilled precise, eternal, and perfect functions. Think of it as a perfectly calibrated machine, each angel a cog in a grand, celestial clockwork. Among them were the Watchers, the Grigori, angels of a special rank, whose sole task was to watch, to observe creation from above, to ensure that everything followed its natural course. Theirs was a lonely vigil, an eternal gaze cast upon a world slowly unfolding. But something changed. It wasn't a sudden shift, but a gradual erosion, like rust corroding metal. The Watchers looked down, towards the young earth, towards the valleys where humans were beginning to build their first villages. They watched as these fragile beings stumbled and thrived, their lives a fleeting flicker against the backdrop of eternity. And then they saw her. They saw them, the daughters of men. There was nothing extraordinary about them at first glance. They were mortal, fragile, destined to die in a few decades. Yet, they possessed something no angel possessed. The imperfect movement of life, the laughter, the tears, the way sweat glistened on their foreheads after toiling the earth, the way their hair moved in the evening wind as they walked towards the river to bathe. It was this very imperfection, this vulnerability, that captivated the celestial observers. The Watchers began to look longer than necessary. At first, it was just curiosity, then fascination, and finally obsession. Their gaze lingered, their thoughts strayed, and the boundaries between their celestial duties and earthly desires began to blur. The weight of their responsibility became lighter, the allure of mortality grew stronger. Semyaza was their leader, an angel of high rank, responsible, powerful. For centuries, he had fulfilled his duty without question. He was the embodiment of celestial order, a being of pure discipline and unwavering loyalty. But one afternoon, while observing a valley near Mount Hermon, he saw a woman weaving under the shade of an olive tree. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating golden patterns on her skin. She was singing something, a simple melody her mother had taught her, a song of the earth, of love, of loss. It wasn't a celestial song, perfect and mathematical. It was something more. It was human, it was real. And Semyaza felt something he had never experienced before. Desire. Not the abstract desire to serve or fulfill a function. No, the desire to touch, to be touched, to know what it felt like to be close to that warmth, that fragility, that mortal beauty that existed only because it knew it would disappear. But Semyaza wasn't alone. Around him, 200 other Watchers had fallen into the same silent trap. Each had their favorite. A woman who combed her hair by the river, another who laughed with her sisters while grinding grain, another who wept silently for a dead child, her pain so beautiful in its devastation that it was impossible to look away. They saw their own longing reflected in the eyes of these mortals. For months, the Watchers did nothing but watch. Celestial voyeurs, trapped between their duty and something they didn't understand. Their hearts ached with longing, their minds consumed with images of these earthly women. The purity of their purpose was stained by the darkness of their forbidden desires. The heavens began to feel empty, the divine orders, routine, eternity unbearably long. The celestial paradise, once a source of infinite joy, now felt like a gilded cage. Until one night Semyaza summoned the others. They gathered on the summit of Mount Hermon, a sacred place where the earth almost touched the sky. The wind blew cold, laden with the scent of snow from the peaks. Below them, the human villages glowed with small, vulnerable fires, like embers in the vast darkness of the world. There they were, sleeping, unaware that 200 beings of light desired them to the point of madness. Unaware of the celestial battle raging above them, a conflict between duty and desire that would forever alter the course of human history. Semyaza spoke first. His voice, which had once resonated with divine authority, now trembled. It was the voice of a fallen angel, burdened by guilt and consumed by longing. "Brothers," he said, "I know what you feel. I feel it too. Every moment I spend up here is a torment. I want to go down, I want to be with them." The other watchers looked at each other. Some lowered their heads, others nodded in silence. They all knew that what Semyaza was proposing was an absolute betrayal. To abandon heaven, to disobey the Creator, to become mortal for love. It was a fall from grace of unimaginable magnitude. But Semyaza was afraid, not of God, but of something worse, of doing it alone. "If I go down alone," he continued, "the curse will fall only on me, and you will remain here, eternally watching me suffer. But if we go down together, if we all swear to do it at the same time, then the guilt will be shared. None will be able to betray the others, and if God punishes us, he will punish us all equally." It was a strange pact, a conspiracy born of fear and lust. They weren't going down out of ideological rebellion or to challenge the divine order. They were going down because they could no longer bear the distance, because they had seen something more valuable than eternity. The possibility of being loved by someone who could choose not to love them. The potential for a connection that transcended the boundaries of the celestial and the mortal. One by one, the 200 watchers took the oath. They bound their destinies with words that echoed in the mountain like distant thunder. A vow of defiance, a promise of eternal damnation, all for the sake of a fleeting moment of earthly pleasure. And then, for the first time since the creation of the world, celestial beings descended, not as messengers, not as warriors, but as desperate lovers. They relinquished their immortality, they cast aside their divine duties, and they embraced the uncertain fate of mortals. They descended with the light of dawn. The women who saw them arrive didn't feel terror. How could they? They were beautiful beyond any human standard. They shone with a soft light, as if they were made of the essence of the sun. Their voices were music. Their eyes contained centuries of wisdom. And when they spoke, each word seemed a promise of something greater than life itself. The women were captivated, seduced by the irresistible charm of these celestial beings. The women didn't know they were looking at their own destruction, because what began as seduction soon became an exchange. The watchers didn't just want bodies, they wanted to be needed. They yearned for connection, for companionship, for the warmth of human affection. They wanted these women to choose them, not because of their divine nature, but because of what they could offer them. And so began the teaching of forbidden secrets, the unveiling of knowledge that was never meant to be known by mortal minds. Asael was the first, an angel of metallurgy and war. He taught men how to forge swords and spears, but that wasn't what really mattered. He taught the women something much more dangerous. He taught them to see themselves as something that could be improved. He showed them how to polish metals into mirrors, how to extract pigments from plants to paint their eyelids, how to carve precious stones and turn them into necklaces that captured the light. He taught them vanity. Or, to put it another way, he taught them the power of conscious beauty, because before Asael, a woman was beautiful without knowing it. After him, a woman could construct her beauty, use it, turn it into a weapon or currency. And that changed everything. The balance of power shifted, The dynamics of relationships transformed, and the foundations of human society began to crack. Other watchers taught different things. Shamsiel revealed the signs of the sun and moon, allowing people to predict seasons and eclipses. Barakiel taught astrology. Koel showed the knowledge of the constellations. But the most dangerous was perhaps Penemu, who taught how to write with ink and parchment. Because with writing came the possibility of preserving spells, formulas, curses. With writing, forbidden knowledge no longer depended on memory. It could be transmitted, accumulated, grow. It could be shared, studied, and expanded upon, creating a dangerous repository of arcane secrets. The women learned to cut roots under the full moon, to prepare brews that made people sleep or awaken desires, to invoke spirits whose names only the angels knew. They became something that had never existed before. Witches, women with power over the occult. Women who no longer needed to wait for men to protect them, because now they could protect themselves or attack. The world changed in a single generation. The old ways were forgotten, the ancient traditions abandoned, and a new era of magic and mayhem dawned upon the earth. The villages that had once lived in fragile balance were now armed. Men fought with weapons that should never have existed. Women used beauty and witchcraft to get what they wanted. And in the middle of it all, the watchers were in love, blind, drunk on mortality. They were captivated by their lovers, enthralled by their newfound power, and oblivious to the chaos they had unleashed. They thought they had won. They thought they had found something better than heaven. They didn't know that their lovers were already pregnant and that what was growing inside them wasn't human. The seeds of their destruction had been sown, and the harvest would be one of unimaginable horror. The first symptoms were strange, but not alarming. The women who had lain with the watchers began to feel an insatiable hunger. They ate twice, 3 times as much as normal, and still their stomachs roared as if they were empty. Their bodies changed faster than they should have. Within weeks, their bellies swelled as if they were months pregnant. At first, the villages celebrated. A child of a watcher, they thought, would be special, blessed, strong, wise, beautiful like their celestial father. They saw it as a sign of divine favor, a promise of a golden age to come. They couldn't imagine the truth, the monstrous reality that was gestating within these women, the unimaginable horror that was about to be unleashed upon the world. There was a woman named Leora, who lived near the Jordan Valley. She was young, barely 18, and had been chosen by one of the watchers called Arakiel. He had taught her the secrets of the earth, how to read the future in the entrails of animals, how to feel the vibrations of the ground before an earthquake. He had shared with her the mysteries of the natural world, granting her insights and abilities that were beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. Leora loved him with an intensity that frightened her family. She said that when he touched her, she could feel the pulse of the universe. But as her pregnancy progressed, love turned into terror. The divine blessing transformed into a monstrous curse. Her belly grew so large that she couldn't walk without help. The skin stretched until it became translucent, and beneath it, one could see movements that weren't normal. They weren't the soft kicks of a baby. They were blows, punches from within, as if something wanted to force its way out. Leora cried every night. Her mother tried to comfort her, but even she was beginning to be afraid. The whispers in the village grew louder, the looks more fearful, and the sense of impending doom became palpable. The other women, pregnant by watchers, experienced the same thing. Some couldn't get out of bed. Their bones creaked under the weight of what was growing inside them. Several began to bleed, but the healers didn't know how to stop it. It was as if their bodies were being consumed from within, their life force drained by the insatiable hunger of their monstrous offspring. And then came the moment of birth. Leora gave birth on a moonless night. The midwives who attended her prayed in low voices, invoking names of gods and spirits that they barely remembered. The pain was inhuman. Leora screamed until her voice broke, until only guttural, animal sounds came out. She pushed, but what was trying to come out was too big, too strong. The forces of creation and destruction were locked in a fierce battle within her body. When the baby finally emerged, one of the midwives fell backward in horror. her eyes wide with disbelief, her face pale with terror. It wasn't a baby. It was a giant. It measured almost a meter long at birth. Its limbs were disproportionate, its hands the size of an adult's. But the most disturbing thing was its eyes. They didn't have the innocent opacity of a newborn. They were clear, conscious, as if they already knew things that no human being should know. As if they held the secrets of the universe within their depths. Leora died 3 hours later. Her body simply couldn't recover from the trauma. She bled to death while her son, the Nephilim, was fed goat's milk by his grandmother. But it wasn't enough. The child cried constantly, a deep and resonant cry that made the walls of the house tremble. And it grew. It grew so fast that on the 3rd day, it already looked like a 5-year-old child. A terrifyingly large and powerful child, with an insatiable hunger and an unnatural strength. This scene was repeated in hundreds of villages. The women who survived childbirth were shattered physically and emotionally. Many never walked again. Others went mad, unable to accept that they had brought monsters into the world. The weight of their guilt and the horror of their experience drove them to the brink of sanity. And the Nephilim, those hybrid children of angel and human, kept growing. Within months, they were bigger than any man. Within a few years, they measured 3, 4, 5 meters in height. They were strong as 10 men together, and they were hungry. A hunger that never ended. A hunger that would consume everything in its path. At first, they ate livestock. Cows, sheep, goats. An entire village could lose its entire flock in a week to feed a single Nephilim. The villagers tried to complain, but what could they do? The parents of these creatures were watchers, fallen angels who still retained superhuman powers. No one dared to challenge them. The fear of celestial retribution kept them silent, even as their livelihoods were devoured by these monstrous offspring. But livestock wasn't enough. The Nephilim began to hunt. First, wild animals, lions, bears, anything that could provide meat. But soon even that ceased to be enough. And then, inevitably, they began to look at humans. The desperation in their eyes grew. Their hunger became more pronounced, and the line between predator and prey began to blur. There is an account that was preserved in fragments, written by a scribe who managed to escape before his village was devoured. He describes how a Nephilim named Oya entered the communal granary one night and ate all the grain reserves. When the villagers went to complain, Oya looked at them with empty eyes and said, "I'm still hungry." And then he ate 3 of them. It wasn't an act of deliberate evil. It was pragmatic. To Oya, humans were simply another source of food, smaller than livestock, easier to catch, and their meat, according to some of the darker texts, tasted better. The world began to disintegrate. The fabric of society tore apart. The bonds of community shattered, and humanity teetered on the edge of extinction. The mothers of the Nephilim, those who survived, lived in a kind of moral limbo. How do you hate your own child? How do you kill it when it keeps calling you mother, even with a voice that makes stones tremble? Some tried to flee, others committed suicide, unable to bear the guilt of knowing that they had been complicit in the destruction of the world. Their lives were filled with regret, their souls haunted by the monstrous legacy they had created. And the Watchers, their celestial lovers, didn't know what to do either. They had come down for love. They had renounced heaven for the possibility of being loved. But now they were trapped in semi-mortal bodies, watching as their children destroyed everything they touched. Their dreams of earthly paradise had turned into a living nightmare. Some Watchers tried to control them. Others simply walked away, hiding in remote mountains, unable to face the consequences of their desire. Their once radiant faces were now etched with despair, their hearts heavy with grief. Semyaza, the leader, was perhaps the most torn of all. His lover, a woman named Ista, had died in childbirth. His son, a Nephilim almost 6 meters tall, had taken the name of Hiwa. Hiwa was one of the worst. He not only ate humans, he hunted them for sport. He organized competitions with other Nephilim to see who could kill the most in one night. His cruelty knew no bounds, his lust for violence was insatiable, and his presence brought terror to the hearts of all who knew him. Semyaza tried to reason with him. Once, by the light of a bonfire, Father and son sat face to face. Semyaza, who had been an angel of light, now looked emaciated, with deep dark circles under his eyes and hands that trembled. The weight of his sins had aged him beyond recognition. Hiwa, he said, you have to stop. You're destroying the world. Hiwa looked at him with something akin to curiosity. Why should I stop? I'm hungry, and they are weak. You gave me this strength, Father. Now you ask me not to use it. I didn't give you anything. You're a mistake. I am a mistake. Hiwa smiled. It was a terrible smile, too big for his face. Mistakes don't regret, Father. Mistakes simply are. That was the last conversation they had. Hiwa got up and walked towards the next village. Semyaza remained sitting by the fire, crying for the first time in his existence. Not tears of celestial light, but human tears, salty, bitter, useless. His grief was profound, his despair overwhelming, and the weight of his responsibility crushed his soul. Meanwhile, in heaven, God watched, not with anger, although later texts would try to paint it that way. He watched with something more complex, sadness perhaps, or disappointment. He had given freedom to his creations, both angels and humans. And freedom always included the possibility of catastrophe. The risk of corruption, the potential for destruction, were inherent in the gift of free will. But the cries of the human mothers, the pleas of the villagers who saw their children devoured, the agony of a world that was crumbling under the weight of the Nephilim, all of that reached him, and something had to change. The balance of creation had been disrupted, the harmony of the universe shattered, and divine intervention was now necessary to restore order. The archangels were summoned. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, each with a specific task. They were the instruments of divine will, the embodiment of celestial justice, and the guardians of the cosmic order. Michael would be the warrior, the one who would eventually chain the watchers. Gabriel would be the messenger, the one who would warn the few righteous who remained. Raphael would be the healer, the one who would try to restore what could be saved. And Uriel would be the witness, the one who would record everything so that it would never be forgotten. The story of the fall, the suffering of humanity, and the consequences of unchecked desire would be preserved for all eternity. But before the archangels acted, something more drastic was needed, something that would cleanse the earth from the root. Not as punishment, although that's how they would interpret it later, but as mercy. For the women who lived in a world where their own children terrorized them, where every night could be the last, where love had become a nightmare, death was beginning to seem like a release. A welcome escape from the unbearable horrors of their existence. And then it began to rain. Not immediately. First, there were signs, tremors in the earth, birds flying in the wrong directions, rivers changing course for no apparent reason. The few wise men who remained, those who had not been corrupted by the forbidden knowledge of the Watchers, began to feel that something enormous was approaching. An impending catastrophe that would forever alter the course of human history. One of them was a man named Noah. He was a carpenter, a simple man who had resisted the temptation to seek out the Watchers or use their magic. He lived with his wife and 3 sons on a small hill far from Nineveh, the great cities. He had seen the Nephilim pass in the distance. He had heard the screams, but he had kept his family hidden. He had clung to his faith, maintained his integrity, and lived a life of quiet righteousness in a world consumed by darkness. One night, while he slept, he had a dream, or perhaps it was more than a dream, a vision. He saw the world covered in water. He saw the Nephilim drowning, their giant bodies sinking into the depths. He saw the Watchers chained in dark places under the earth, and he saw an ark, an impossible vessel built to survive the impossible. He saw hope amidst the destruction, a promise of renewal amidst the chaos. When he woke up, Gabriel was standing by his bed. The archangel didn't say much. He only gave him precise instructions. Measures, materials, estimated time, and a warning. Don't try to save everyone you can't. Save your family, save the animals, and when the waters rise, don't look back. Noah nodded. He didn't ask why. He didn't question the justice of a flood that would kill innocents along with the guilty, because deep down he too knew that the world had become unsustainable, that something had to end so that something new could begin. The destruction was necessary for the creation of a new world. And so, while the Nephilim continued devouring, while the Watchers sank deeper into their despair, while the surviving women prayed to gods that no longer answered, Noah began to build. The sound of the axe against the wood resonated on the hill. A constant rhythm, almost hypnotic, like a clock marking the last days of the ancient world. Each swing of the axe was a prayer, each plank a testament to his faith. The construction of the ark took decades. Not years, decades. And during all that time, the world continued to crumble. Noah worked from sunrise to sunset, his hands covered in blisters that turned into calluses, then into scars. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, worked alongside him, although they didn't always understand why. Especially at the beginning, when the sky was clear and the idea of a flood that would cover mountains seemed ridiculous. The neighbors mocked them, passing near the hill only to laugh at the madman who was building a boat in the middle of the dry land. "Are you going to sail on the dust, Noah?" they shouted. "Or do you expect the Nephilim to carry you on their shoulders to the sea?" Noah didn't answer. He kept cutting, assembling, sealing every crevice with pitch. His wife, Naamah, watched him from the door of her house with a mixture of faith and sadness, because she knew what her husband didn't dare to say out loud, that they were building a floating coffin for the rest of humanity. Their ark was a symbol of both hope and despair, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the inevitability of divine judgment. Meanwhile, the Nephilim had begun to organize themselves. At first, they were loners, each hunting on his own, but some began to form groups, gangs, almost like tribes of giants with their own hierarchies and territories. The chaos of their existence was gradually giving way to a new form of order, a brutal and terrifying order based on strength and domination. The largest of all called himself Mahwai and had established his domain in the eastern plains. He measured almost 9 meters in height, and his voice was so deep that, when he shouted, the animals fled kilometers away. He was a tyrant, a warlord, and the ruler of a kingdom built on terror and bloodshed. Mahwai had a recurring dream. In it, he saw a stone tablet falling from the sky, submerging in water, and disappearing. He woke up drenched in sweat with a feeling of terror that he couldn't explain. The Nephilim weren't usually afraid. They had no natural predators, but Mahwai felt that something terrible was approaching, a cosmic force that threatened his very existence. He went to see his father, a watcher called Barakiel, who lived in a cave in the mountains. Barakiel had aged. The fallen angels weren't immortal on earth, although they lived much longer than humans. He was a shadow of his former self. His celestial beauty faded. His divine powers diminished. He was a prisoner of his own desires, a fallen angel trapped in a mortal realm. His celestial skin had begun to wrinkle, the radiant glow of his angelic form slowly dimming, like embers fading in the night. The passage of time, so inconsequential in the celestial realm, was now taking its toll on Barakiel. "Father," Mahwai said, crouching low as he entered the cave, "I need you to explain my dreams." Barakiel looked at him, his eyes heavy with weariness. "Your dreams are warnings, son, but there is nothing you can do." "Warnings of what?" Mahwai pressed, his voice tight with apprehension. "Of the end, of the water that comes, of the wrath of the Most High." A profound sadness lined Barakiel's face, etching itself into the fading beauty. Mahwai clenched his fists, frustration and anger bubbling up inside him. Small rocks tumbled from the cave walls, disturbed by the Nephilim's rising emotions. "And what am I supposed to do? Drown in silence? Let him erase us as if we never existed?" He paced the cave, his agitation filling the space. "Yes," Barakiel replied simply. "Exactly that." The words were spoken with a quiet resignation that only fueled Mahwai's fury. It was an answer Mahwai would not accept. He stormed out of the cave, his mind racing, and gathered the other Nephilim. He spoke of the dream, of the tablet sinking beneath the waves, of the chilling premonition of destruction. Some laughed, dismissing his fears as weakness. Others grew uneasy, sensing the truth in his words. But they all agreed on one thing. If the end was coming, they would face it with open eyes, not like startled animals caught in a storm. They would not go quietly into oblivion. They sent emissaries to Enoch, Noah's great-grandfather. Enoch was renowned as the only human who could still walk between heaven and earth, a bridge between the divine and mortal realms. He was a prophet, a visionary, touched by the hand of God. If anyone could intercede with the Almighty, it was him. But when the Nephilim found Enoch, the old man shook his head even before they could speak. His gaze was fixed, knowing, almost as if he had been expecting them. "I already know what you are going to ask," he said, his voice raspy but firm. He was an aged man. His body stooped with the weight of years, but his eyes burned with an unnatural clarity, piercing through the very souls of those who stood before him. And the answer is no. There is no intercession possible. There is no forgiveness. You should not exist. You are a cosmic error that must be corrected. His pronouncements echoed with the weight of divine judgment. One of the Nephilim, consumed by rage, raised his hand to crush the frail old man, but his arm froze in midair, paralyzed by an unseen force. An invisible barrier held him back, a testament to Enoch's connection to the divine. Enoch stared at him, his gaze unwavering. "You may kill me," he said softly, his voice filled with pity rather than fear. "But it will change nothing. The water has already been summoned. The fountains of the deep are already trembling. You have perhaps a year, perhaps less. Use it as you will." And without another word, Enoch turned and disappeared into the hills, leaving the Nephilim stunned and defeated. It is said that that was the last time anyone saw Enoch on earth. Days later, according to the Book of Enoch, he was taken to heaven in a chariot of fire, snatched away before the deluge could claim him. Some say it was a reward for his unwavering fidelity, others that it was simply too painful for him to witness the destruction that was to come. Whatever the reason, Enoch was gone, leaving the Nephilim to face their fate alone. The Nephilim returned to their territories, but something had irrevocably changed. Denial was no longer an option. Death was approaching, and for the first time in their short but violent lives, they felt fear, a cold and gnawing dread that settled deep in their hearts. Some reacted with fury, becoming even more savage, destroying everything in their path as if they could somehow kill destiny itself. They rampaged across the land, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake, their actions fueled by a desperate attempt to assert control in the face of impending doom. Others turned melancholic, retreating into themselves, lost in despair. They sat on mountain peaks, gazing at the horizon, awaiting the inevitable end. And the women, the few who remained alive, the mothers who had survived childbirth and years of horror, also felt the change in the air. They sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle signs of impending catastrophe. One of them was called Yael. She had been one of the first to lie with a watcher, seduced by promises of eternal beauty and infinite wisdom. The reality, however, had been far from the alluring promises. Her son, a Nephilim named Ohiah, had killed dozens of people. Yael knew it. She had seen the bones outside his cave. She had smelled the blood on his breath. She lived in a state of perpetual horror, unable to flee, but equally unable to love the creature that had emerged from her womb. Ohiah still called her mother. Sometimes he would bring her food, the carcasses of animals he had hunted. But the way he looked at her, with those eyes that were too intelligent, too cold, made Yael want to scream. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. One night, Ohiah did not return. Yael waited all night, and for the first time in years, she felt something akin to relief. Perhaps he was dead. Perhaps another Nephilim had killed him in a fight. Perhaps he had simply left. But as the sun rose, Ohiah was standing before the cave, and he was weeping. Nephilim did not weep. They were creatures of immense strength and terrifying power, seemingly incapable of human emotion. They were not supposed to be able to, but Ohiah was crying, great sobs that shook the very ground. Yael approached slowly, almost disbelievingly. "What happened?" she whispered. her voice barely audible. "I know I'm going to die," he said, his voice, usually so strong, now a broken murmur. "I feel the water in my dreams. Covers my mouth, my lungs. I can't breathe and I sink. I sink and there is no bottom." His words were filled with a raw, visceral fear that pierced through Yael's hardened heart. Yael did not know what to say. Part of her wanted to comfort him. He was her son after all. But another part, the part that had suffered every day since he was born, felt a dark satisfaction. "Perhaps it's what you deserve," she said finally, the words laced with bitterness. Ohia looked at her, not with anger, but with sadness. "Do you think I chose to be this? Do you think I asked to be born?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, because there was no answer. Ohia had not chosen anything, and neither had Yael. Not even the Watchers, in a sense, had chosen. They had followed their nature, their desires, and the entire world had paid the price. The sky began to darken, not suddenly, but gradually. Gray clouds amassed from all horizons, converging upon the earth like a sentence. The air grew heavy, laden with moisture. The animals acted strangely. Birds flew in circles, refusing to land. Dogs howled for no apparent reason. Cows refused to leave their barns. Noah finished the ark just in time. It was enormous, so large that it seemed impossible that one man and his sons could have built it. 3 stories high, with intricate compartments for different kinds of animals, and ventilation systems that would allow air to circulate even with the hatches closed. It was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was also a tomb, for everyone knew that whatever remained outside those wooden walls would not survive. The animals began to arrive on their own. Noah did not have to hunt them. They came in pairs, guided by an instinct that they themselves did not understand. Lions and lambs walked side by side. Snakes coiled peacefully next to mice. It was as if all of nature knew that old enmities no longer mattered, that only survival mattered now. People began to notice. The jeers turned into questions, then into pleas. "Noah, let us in. We have children. We don't deserve to die." But Noah, his heart breaking, shook his head. "There is no room. It is not my decision. I am sorry. I am so sorry." Some tried to force their way in, but every time someone tried to climb the ramp, an invisible force pushed them back. It was as if the ark itself rejected the unchosen. Mothers held their babies up high, begging, "At least save the children. They have done nothing wrong." Naamah, Noah's wife, wept silently inside the ark. Her daughters-in-law wept too, because they knew that outside there were good people, innocent people, children who had never seen a Nephilim, who had never asked for forbidden knowledge, and they were all going to die. "Why?" Naamah asked her husband that last night before the gates were closed. "Why can't anyone else be saved?" Noah had no answer. He could only repeat what Gabriel had told him. The world is too broken. The blood of angels and humans has mixed in ways that cannot be undone. The only way to start over is to erase everything and begin from scratch. But that's not fair. "No," Noah admitted, his voice heavy with grief. "It is not." And then, in the pre-dawn hours of the appointed day, the gates of heaven opened. The first drop fell on the forehead of a child playing in the dust. He stopped, confused. He looked up. The sky was black, blacker than any storm he had ever seen. And then another drop fell, and another. And suddenly, as if someone had torn the sky itself, the water began to fall in torrents so dense that it was impossible to see more than a few feet away. It was not rain. It was a waterfall falling from all directions at once. At first, people ran to their homes, closing doors and windows, convinced that it was just an unusual storm. It would last a few hours, maybe a day. But the water did not stop, and as it fell from the sky, something else was happening underground. The fountains of the deep burst open. In the valleys, the ground began to crack. From those cracks, jets of water erupted under immense pressure, as if the earth itself were vomiting entire oceans that it had kept inside since the beginning of time. Underground rivers that no one knew existed emerged with violent fury, carrying away rocks and trees. Within hours, the villages in the valleys were submerged. People climbed to the roofs, then to the hills, but the water rose faster than they could climb. Entire families were swept away, their screams drowned out by the deafening roar of a world turning into an ocean. The Nephilim, with their great stature, lasted longer. Maui, the 30-foot giant, stood on the summit of a hill as the water reached his knees. He looked around. He could see other Nephilim on different mountains, colossal figures surrounded by rising water. Some were shouting, cursing the sky. Others simply waited in silence, like ancient statues being devoured by the sea. Maui thought of his dream, the tablet sinking. Now he understood. He was the tablet. They all were. Forbidden knowledge, power that should not exist, being erased from the book of creation. The water reached his waist, then his chest. He tried to swim, but his body was too dense, too heavy. The Nephilim did not float. They sank like stones. As the water covered his head, Maui opened his eyes beneath the surface. He saw other giants sinking around him, their arms outstretched toward a surface that was receding further and further away. He also saw human bodies, hundreds, thousands, floating lifelessly, rocked by the currents like leaves in autumn. And then, in the depths, he saw something else. Chains of light. The archangels had descended. Michael, his flaming sword now transformed into a whip of lightning, was binding the watchers one by one. He dragged them down, toward places in the abyss so deep that not even sunlight would ever reach them, dungeons carved into the primordial rock, sealed with seals that only God could break. Semihaza was the first to be chained. Michael found him floating in the water, no longer resisting. The former leader of the Watchers simply extended his wrists, accepting his fate. Michael looked at him with something that might have been compassion. "Was it worth it?" the archangel asked, his voice echoing through the water. Semihaza thought of Ishtar, of the way her hair shone in the sun, of her laughter, of the nights they had spent together when, for the first time in his eternal existence, he had felt that he belonged to something greater than duty. And he thought of Hiwa, his monstrous son, who was probably already dead, drowned somewhere in that infinite ocean. "Yes," he whispered finally. "It was worth it, even if only for a moment." Michael did not respond. He simply dragged him into the depths, where a cell of absolute darkness awaited. There, Semihaza and the other Watchers would remain chained until the day of judgment, without light, without time, only the echo of their own thoughts and the weight of guilt. Asarel, the one who had taught vanity and war, tried to fight. When Gabriel came for him, he summoned what remained of his celestial power. He unleashed flames that were extinguished instantly in the water. He invoked winds that found no air to blow. But it was useless. A fallen angel, however powerful, could not stand against an archangel who still served the Most High. "This is not fair." Asael screamed as the chains closed around his wrists. "I only gave them what they already wanted: beauty, power, the freedom to choose. And look what they did with that freedom," Gabriel replied, his voice filled with righteous anger. "Look at the world you helped create." Asael looked. He saw the water stained red. He saw bodies floating by the millions. He saw the end of an era, and for the first time, something akin to remorse pierced his chest. But it was too late for repentance. One by one, the 200 Watchers were captured and chained. Some pleaded, others cursed. A few went silently, almost grateful for the end. And in the depths of the earth, in caverns that existed outside of normal time, they were sealed. There they would remain, conscious but immobile, until the end of days. Above, on the surface of the new ocean, Noah's Ark floated. It was the only man-made object that remained visible. Everything else had been swallowed. Cities, temples, markets, the places where women had learned to paint their eyes with antimony, the altars where forbidden sacrifices had been performed, the forges where the first swords had been created, all underwater, all erased. Inside the ark, Noah's family clung to each other as the vessel was shaken by waves the size of mountains. The animals moaned in terror but remained alive. The stench was overwhelming. Manure, sweat, fear. But they were alive. Naamah could not stop crying. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the people who had pleaded to enter, the children, the mothers, the elderly who had never harmed anyone. "How are we going to live with this?" she asked Noah one night as the storm raged outside. "How are we going to wake up every morning knowing that we survived while everyone else died?" Noah had no answer. He could only hold her as she trembled. Shem, the eldest son, approached his father days later. "What if we're the only ones left? What if, when the water goes down, there are only 8 of us? How are we going to repopulate the entire world?" "We will," Noah said, although his voice lacked conviction. God would not have saved us only to let us die afterward. But inside, Noah also had doubts that he dared not verbalize. What if God had made a mistake? What if there was another way? What if the innocent who died outside deserved to live more than him, who had closed the door in their faces? The nights were the worst. In the darkness of the ark, with only the sound of the water hitting the wooden walls, it was easy to imagine that they were the only living beings in the entire universe, that God had decided to end the experiment called life and start over. Or perhaps not start over, perhaps just let them float eternally in an endless ocean. But the nights passed, and the weeks passed too. And slowly, very slowly, the rain began to diminish. It did not stop suddenly. It was gradual, from a constant deluge to a heavy downpour, then to normal rain, then to a drizzle. And finally, after 40 days and 40 nights, the sky cleared. The water stopped falling, but the world remained submerged. The highest mountains barely protruded like small islands. The ark floated aimlessly, rocked by currents that led nowhere. Noah released a raven, hoping it would find land. The bird flew away and did not return. Good sign or bad? Impossible to know. Days later, he released a dove. The dove returned at dusk, exhausted, having found no place to land. Noah waited another week and released another dove. This time, the bird returned with an olive branch in its beak. Naamah wept when she saw the branch, not from sadness this time, but from relief. It meant that there was land out there, that trees were emerging, that life could begin again. A week later, Noah released a third dove. This time, the bird did not return. It had found a home. Noah opened the top hatch of the ark and looked out for the first time in months. The world he saw did not resemble the one he had left. The water still covered vast expanses, but on the horizon he could see land. Bare mountains without vegetation, like the bones of a giant corpse emerging from rotting flesh. There were no cities, no smoke from campfires, no human voices. Only silence, a silence so profound that it hurt the ears. "Is this what you wanted?" Noah whispered toward the sky. "An empty world?" There was no response. Or perhaps the response was precisely that silence. A blank canvas, a second chance, but also a crushing responsibility, because now everything depended on them. The ark finally ran aground on the summit of Mount Ararat. The impact was gentle, almost delicate, as if invisible hands had carefully placed it. Noah waited an entire day before opening the door. He was afraid of what he would find. What if the air was poisoned? What if the land was dead? What if they went out only to die from some disease arising from the putrefaction of millions of corpses? But finally, he mustered enough courage. He lowered the ramp with his sons. The ground beneath their feet was thick, sticky mud. It smelled of salt and decomposition, but it was solid. It was real. The animals came out next, cautious at first, then with growing confidence. The lions emerged and roared at a world that no longer knew them. The wolves howled. The birds flew in ascending spirals, as if celebrating their freedom, and slowly, life began to disperse again across the earth. Noah built an altar with the first stones he found. He sacrificed some of the clean animals he had brought, offering them as thanks. The smoke rose toward the gray sky, and then, for the first time since the flood began, God spoke, not with audible words, but with a covenant. A rainbow appeared in the sky, shining with colors that seemed impossible after so much darkness. It was a promise. Never again would he destroy the world with water. Never again would he erase all life from the face of the earth. Noah should have felt comforted, but all he felt was exhaustion. An exhaustion so deep that it reached into his bones. He had survived the end of the world, But the question that tormented him was simple. For what? The first years after the flood were strange. The world was empty in a way that was almost impossible to comprehend. Noah and his family walked through valleys where cities had once stood, and all they found were rocks polished by the water and, occasionally, fragments of pottery embedded in the dry mud. Nothing else. No skeletons, no ruins. The flood had been so complete that even the bones had been swept away into the depths of the ocean or buried under layers of sediment that would take millennia to erode. It was as if the previous humanity had never existed, except in dreams. Naamah dreamed of voices, thousands of overlapping voices calling her, begging her to open the door of the ark. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, unable to distinguish for a moment whether she was still in the ark or whether she had finally touched land. Her daughters-in-law had similar nightmares, seeing faces pressed against walls of water, outstretched hands, lifeless, open eyes. Only Noah seemed not to dream, or perhaps he simply did not speak of it. They planted a vineyard on the south slope of Ararat. The land was fertile, enriched by the sediments that the flood had deposited. The seeds they had saved in the ark sprouted with surprising speed, as if the earth itself were hungry for life. Within a few years, they had grain, vegetables, and grapes hanging in heavy, sweet clusters. Noah made wine from those grapes, and he drank. He drank to forget the sound of the children crying outside the ark. He drank so as not to think about the mothers who had held their babies above their heads as the water covered them in a last desperate attempt to save them. He drank until the world blurred and the voices in his head fell silent. One afternoon, Ham, his second son, found him naked and drunk inside his tent. Noah had drunk so much that he had lost consciousness, lying on the floor with his clothes thrown aside. Ham went out and called his brothers, Shem and Japheth, who entered walking backward, holding a blanket to cover their father without looking at him. When Noah awoke and learned what had happened, he cursed Ham, or more specifically, he cursed Canaan, Ham's son. It was a strange curse, disproportionate to the offense, as if all the accumulated pain, guilt, and shame of being the sole survivor had been channeled into that moment of humiliation. A dark torrent unleashed. But curses, once uttered, carry weight, especially the curses of someone chosen by God to save the world. A divine imprimatur, so to speak. Years passed. Noah's family slowly multiplied. His sons had children, and they had more children. Small villages began to form, dotting the landscape like nascent constellations. Yet, there was something different about this new humanity. A wariness, a shadow lurking just beneath the surface. For even though the Nephilim were dead, and the Watchers chained in the depths, their legacy remained. The forbidden knowledge the fallen angels had imparted had not completely vanished. Some secrets had been preserved, whispered from mouth to ear in the last generations before the flood. And now, slowly, tentatively, they began to resurface. Women started to recall the beauty techniques Azazel had taught. They no longer possessed polished metal mirrors like before, the exquisite reflections now just a memory, but they could use still water, a dark, imperfect glass. They began to experiment with natural dyes for their lips, crushing berries and flowers, with coal for their eyes, burning certain woods and collecting the soot. And though they did it in secret, with shame, as if touching something cursed, they couldn't help themselves. The allure was too strong, because beauty, once known, cannot be unlearned. It becomes a part of the soul. The men, for their part, remembered the weapons, the swords, the spears with metal tips that pierced flesh far better than stone. Useless now for hunting, deadly in the New World Order. And though at first there was no need for war because they were so few and the land was so vast, they began to forge them anyway, just in case. A dark impulse, a primal urge to defend and conquer. And slowly, generation after generation, the world began to resemble the world before the flood. Not identical, but disturbingly similar, because humans remained humans with the same weaknesses, the same desires, the same fears. The human heart, it seemed, was immutable. Naamah lived long enough to see her great-grandchildren. She lived long enough to witness the first territorial squabbles between clans. She lived long enough to see a young woman apply malachite dust to her eyelids and recognize the echo of something ancient and forbidden in that gesture. One night, shortly before she died, she called her grandchildren to her side. There were almost 20 of them, huddled around her bed, waiting for her last words, their faces etched with worry and grief. "The flood washed away nothing," she said, her voice weak but clear. They all leaned in close. "We thought it did. We thought the water would cleanse everything, but all it did was press the reset button. The seed of what we were is still inside us, and it's going to grow again. It's already growing." Her grandchildren exchanged uncomfortable glances. They couldn't tell if it was wisdom or the delirium of an old woman clinging to life. "Then what did we survive for?" asked one of them, a young woman named Sarah. "If it's all going to be the same anyway, what was the point?" Naima closed her eyes, picturing all the faces she had seen, all the things she had lost. "I don't know, child," she rasped. "I've spent my whole life searching for that answer, and all I can tell you is this. Maybe it wasn't about changing what we are. Maybe it was just about giving us another chance to try." She died that same night, and with her went the last person who had seen the world before with her own eyes. From that moment on, the flood would become a legend, a myth, something grandparents told their grandchildren by the fire, and that each generation believed a little less. The water, they said, never existed, a story to scare children. But in other places, in the depths of the earth, the watchers remained awake. They had no bodies that could move. The chains Michael had forged were absolute, an unbreakable prison. But their minds remained conscious, and in the infinite darkness of their prisons, they had plenty of time to think, to remember, to regret. Semihaza thought of Etarjal in the last moments before the water separated them. In the question he had never asked her, "Did you love me because you wanted to, or because I dazzled you with power you didn't understand? Was it love or mere awe?" Azael thought of the women he had taught, of how their eyes had shone when they first saw themselves in a mirror and realized the power they possessed. Not power over men, although that too, but power over themselves, the ability to transform, to become something more than what they were born. Was that so bad? He wondered. Was that worthy of eternal punishment? Was the sin vanity and pride, or was it something else entirely? Yekin, the one who had taught the signs of the sky, thought of the stars he could no longer see, in how humans had used that knowledge to predict the seasons, to navigate, to understand their place in the cosmos. Yes, some had used it for astrology to try to predict the future and control destiny, but others had simply looked up in awe. Was his sharing of knowledge worth the destruction of the world? Worth his eternal imprisonment? It didn't matter what they thought. Their opinions changed nothing. They were locked away until the end of time, and the world kept turning without them. Up above, on the earth, generations passed like waves. New cities were built, new stories were invented. The descendants of Noah scattered across all the continents, carrying with them distorted fragments of what had happened. Some cultures remembered a great flood, others remembered angels who came down from the sky, others spoke of giants. But over time, each culture adapted the stories to its own needs, its own fears, its own questions about the origin of evil. The past was remembered, but the truth was lost. And the women, the poor women who had been at the center of it all, were mostly forgotten or worse yet, blamed. It was easier to blame Eve for biting the fruit than to ask why God had put the tree there in the first place. It was easier to blame the daughters of men for seducing the angels than to ask what kind of God created angels capable of falling. It was easier to blame Pandora for opening the box than to ask who had filled it with evils. And so, from generation to generation, the story was rewritten, twisted, and contorted to serve different agendas. The women who had loved the Watchers became temptresses. Those who had given birth to the Nephilim became mothers of monsters. Those who had learned magic and beauty became dangerous witches who were to be feared and controlled. The world was not safe for powerful women, then or now. But in some places, in dark corners and forbidden margins, another version was preserved. There was a book, several books, actually copies of the Book of Enoch, hidden in caves, buried in deserts, protected by marginalized communities who knew that what they contained was dangerous. Dangerous because it told a different story, not the story of obedience and punishment, but the story of desire and its consequences. The story of immortal beings who chose mortality for love. The story of women who received knowledge and used it for good or for ill. The story of a God who had to drown his own creation because there was no other way to stop the spiral of chaos that free will had unleashed. It was an uncomfortable story, with no clear villains, no pure heroes, just complex characters making impossible decisions in situations that should never have existed. The world was not made of heroes and villains, just people struggling to survive. And perhaps that was why it was censored, because simple stories are easier to use to control people. Complex stories ask questions, and questions are dangerous. The powerful, they always fear questions. But some kept reading, kept copying, kept questioning. In the 3rd century, a scribe in Egypt copied the Book of Enoch, his hands trembling, not from cold, but from something akin to reverent fear. When he finished, he hid the manuscript in a ceramic jar and sealed it, protecting the past. That jar was found 1,700 years later in a cave near the Dead Sea, along with other texts that had been too dangerous to destroy but too heretical to preserve openly. The secrets were kept close, for they were both a blessing and a curse. And when modern archaeologists found those texts and began to translate them, the story of the Watchers emerged again like something that had been sleeping beneath the earth, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Because stories, unlike civilizations, do not drown. They can be buried, they can be forgotten, but they always find a way to resurface. The truth can stay hidden, but it can never be destroyed. And this story, the story of the forbidden romance that corrupted humanity, returned now with new questions for a new era. What does corruption really mean? Is knowledge itself corrupt, or only the use we make of it? Were the women who learned to be beautiful and powerful victims or accomplices? Were the angels who fell traitors or martyrs of love? And the most important question, if God had to destroy the world once because it went wrong, what makes us think he wouldn't do it again? How many times had we gone wrong, and how many more times would we stray from the path? There was something the Book of Enoch mentioned, but that was rarely discussed in depth. The spirits of the Nephilim. When the giants died drowned in the flood, their bodies sank to the bottom of the new ocean. But according to the text, something of them remained. The Nephilim were hybrids, half angel and half human. And that impossible mixture created something that didn't fit into any established category of creation. Humans have bodies and souls. When they die, their souls go wherever souls go. Angels are pure spirit with no need for physical bodies. But the Nephilim were something in between. And when their massive bodies ceased to function, their spirits became trapped in a limbo. They could not ascend to heaven, they could not descend to Sheol, the place of the dead. They simply remained here on earth invisible, formless, but conscious and hungry. According to the darker traditions, these spirits became what the ancients called demons. Not the later Christian concept of fallen angels serving Satan, but something more primitive. Errant spirits, fragments of broken identities, desperately seeking something to fill the void of their existence. A hole in existence, forever wanting. Some tried to possess human bodies, slipping inside the cracks of the mind when someone was weak, drunk, sick, or desperate. Others simply wandered through desolate places, whispering to travelers, trying to remember what it felt like to have a tongue, a mouth, hands. A constant torment, an eternal struggle. This was one of the reasons the apocryphal texts said why the world after the flood was never completely clean, because although the bodies had been destroyed, the consequences of the original transgression remained like radiation after a nuclear explosion, invisible but lethal. In the villages that arose in the generations after Noah, strange stories began to appear. A child who spoke in voices that were not his own. A woman who suddenly had superhuman strength and attacked her family. An old man who sleepwalked into the desert every night, murmuring names that no one recognized, names like Mahuai, like Oya, like Haiua, the names of the dead Nephilim. The priests and shamans of these early cultures developed rituals to expel these spirits. Primitive exorcisms that involved smoke, chants, animal sacrifices. Sometimes they worked, other times they didn't. And when they didn't, the possessed person was tied up and left in the desert, where they eventually died of thirst or were devoured by wild animals. It was brutal, cruel. But in a world that was barely recovering from its own extinction, brutality was all that was left. The world was harsh and unforgiving. There was a man in the 5th generation after Noah named Nimrod. His name meant "we shall rebel," and he lived up to it. He was an extraordinary hunter, but more than that, he was a visionary, or at least he saw himself as one. Nimrod looked at the scattered world, with small isolated villages, each speaking dialects that were beginning to diverge, each worshipping its own local gods, and he saw chaos, he saw weakness, he saw the same fragmentation that had preceded the flood. "We need to be together," he would say to anyone who would listen. "Separated, we are vulnerable. Together, we are invincible." And he was right to some extent. Unity has power. But Nimrod took the idea beyond what was reasonable. He not only wanted to unite humanity, he wanted to make sure that they could never be scattered again. And for that he needed a symbol, a monument, something so big, so impressive that no one could ignore it. He decided to build a tower, not just any tower, a tower that reached to the sky, a tower so tall that if God decided to send another flood, humanity would have a refuge above the clouds. A tower that said, "We are no longer your toys. We are no longer going to passively wait for you to punish us. We are going to climb up to your level." The Tower of Babel brought together workers from all the villages, promising them food, protection, a purpose, and the people came. Because after the trauma of the flood transmitted through increasingly exaggerated stories, the idea of having a plan against future divine punishments was attractive. They built with baked bricks and bitumen, technology that ironically had been taught originally by the Watchers. Each brick was uniform, perfect, unlike the irregular stones that nature provided. These were man-made, controlled, predictable. The tower grew 10 meters, 20, 50, 100. And the higher it got, the prouder they felt. They began to forget why they were building it. It was no longer a refuge. It was an ego, a monument to human capability, a declaration. We are as good as the gods. Up in the sky, God watched, and for the second time in the short history of post-flood humanity, he had to intervene, but this time not with water, this time with something more subtle, more permanent. One morning, the workers arrived at the construction site as usual, but when they started talking, something was wrong. The words coming out of their mouths made no sense to others. One man was asking for bricks in a language that sounded liquid and musical. Another was responding in a guttural and harsh language. A third was shouting instructions in syllables that seemed made of stacked consonants. They had stopped understanding each other. It wasn't that they had forgotten their original language. Each one could still speak and think normally, but the others no longer understood them. It was as if linguistic reality had fragmented into 1,000 pieces, and each group now inhabited its own bubble of meaning. Construction stopped. How do you coordinate a massive project when no one can communicate? The workers began to band together with those who spoke the same language, and slowly these groups moved away, each seeking its own territory, each developing its own culture. The tower remained unfinished, a skeleton of human ambition forever remembering what happens when you try to force unity without consensus or challenge the divine without humility. Nimrod died years later, embittered. He had wanted to be the leader of a unified humanity. Instead, he became the king of a faction among many. And the stories that were told about him were divided according to who was telling them. To some, he was a hero who had tried to protect humanity. To others, he was a tyrant who had wanted to play God. That is how stories work when there is no common language. Everyone tells their own version. But something else had changed with the confusion of tongues. Linguistic diversity brought diversity of thought, and that diversity, although it complicated cooperation, also made it almost impossible for a single bad idea to spread throughout humanity. In the ancient pre-flood world, when everyone spoke the same language, a corrupt teaching from a watcher could spread like wildfire. Now, with hundreds of different languages, each culture developed its own ideas about morality, beauty, power, gods. Some were better than others, but none could dominate completely. It was a built-in security system, chaotic, frustrating, but effective. And in the midst of all this dispersal, the stories of the Watchers began to mutate. In Mesopotamia, they became the Apkallu, the 7 sages who had taught civilization to humanity before the Great Flood. In Greece, they were transformed into the Titans, ancient gods who had been chained in Tartarus for defying Zeus. In India, echoes of them appeared in stories of Asuras, powerful beings who had fallen from grace because of their pride. Each culture took the same mythical core and reinterpreted it according to its own concerns. But certain elements remained constant. Superior beings who descended, forbidden knowledge that was shared, monstrous hybrids that were born, divine punishment that followed. As if the story were so fundamental, so archetypal, that no matter how much you distorted it, certain patterns always emerged. The memory lived on, no matter how warped. Meanwhile, underground, the chained Watchers felt each of these reinterpretations. They could not see them directly, but they could feel the weight of human attention. Every time someone told a story about fallen angels, every time someone wrote their name in a forbidden manuscript, they felt it like a phantom tingling in limbs they no longer had. For some, it was torture, a constant reminder of what they had lost, of what they had caused. For others, it was the only thing that kept them going, the proof that they had not been completely erased, that their story, however corrupt and tragic, still mattered. Their names would live on, long after they had been forgotten. Azazel felt it every time a woman painted her eyes. He did not know who she was, he could not see her, but he could feel the act, the gesture of transformation, and he wondered, does she regret what I did? Really? Because although he had caused incalculable suffering, he had also given something valuable. The ability of women to see themselves as works of art in progress, to have agency over their own appearance, to use beauty as a tool, as a weapon, as a language. Yes, some would use it to manipulate, others to enslave, but some would use it to empower themselves, to find joy in their own transformation, to say, this is my body, and I decide what to do with it. Did that justify the Nephilim? Did it justify the flood? Did it justify the mothers who died bursting giving birth to monsters? No, of course not. No amount of lipstick justifies genocide, but things are not so simple, they never are. And that complexity, that impossibility of reducing history to good versus bad, was precisely what made the story of the Watchers continue to resonate millennia later, because everyone on some level understands what it is to want something that we know will destroy us. We have all looked at something forbidden and thought, it's worth it. We have all taken knowledge that we shouldn't have and used it in ways that we couldn't foresee. And sooner or later, we have all had to live with the consequences. Over the centuries, the women who descended from those first survivors of the flood began to rediscover the secrets that their ancestors had learned from the Watchers. Not because someone taught them directly, but because certain knowledge seems to be written somewhere deeper than conscious memory, in instinct, in the desire to transform. The old ways, they were never truly gone. A young woman in Babylon, centuries after Babel, discovered that if she ground a certain type of red stone and mixed it with animal fat, she could paint her lips a color that made men look at her differently. She didn't know that she was repeating exactly what Azazel had taught the first women. She had not read the Book of Enoch, which by then was circulating in fragmented copies among marginalized communities. She simply experimented, and it worked. Another woman in Egypt learned that black coal around the eyes not only made them appear larger and more mysterious, but also protected against certain eye infections. Beauty and function united in a single gesture. The priests condemned it as vanity, but the women did it anyway, in secret, in the privacy of their rooms, before going out into the streets where they would pretend that their beauty was just natural, just good fortune. And so, generation after generation, forbidden knowledge seeped back to the surface, like water finding cracks in a dam. The tide could be held back, but never stopped. But it wasn't just beauty, it was also magic. In remote villages of what would one day be Greece, there were women who knew how to cut roots under the new moon to make brews that caused sleep, desire, oblivion. They did not call it witchcraft yet. That term would come later, loaded with condemnation and fear. For now, they simply called it the knowledge of the grandmothers. These women were feared and respected in equal parts. The villagers came to them when someone was sick, when a harvest failed, when a marriage needed help to. They did what they could with the plants they knew, the cycles they had observed, and the words that held power, not because they were magical, but because they were spoken with conviction. These women were midwives, healers, counselors, the cornerstones of their communities. Names like Circe, Medea, Hecate would eventually become legendary, associated with sorcery and peril, whispered in hushed tones around crackling fires. But in their origins, they were simply women who had learned the secrets of the earth, who had preserved knowledge when men were too occupied with war to pay attention to the subtleties of herbs and seasons. And in each of them, in every woman who stirred a potion or painted her eyes with kohl, there was an echo of those first women on Mount Hermon, who had lain with angels and received knowledge they shouldn't have possessed. A dangerous precedent, a seed of rebellion planted in the fertile ground of feminine curiosity. The priests, of course, were not pleased. In every culture that emerged from the post-Babel dispersion, religious structures began to organize, solidify their power. And one of the first things these structures did was attempt to control knowledge, particularly the knowledge that women possessed. Because knowledge is power, and power in the hands of those who were supposed to be submissive was a direct threat to the established order. So they began to tell stories, cautionary tales of women who had used magic and been punished, of beautiful women who had seduced good men and led them to ruin, of witches who cooked babies in cauldrons and made pacts with demons in the dead of night. Each story carefully crafted, each lie a poisoned dart aimed at the heart of female empowerment. None of it was true, not literally. The image of a crone cackling over a bubbling cauldron, stirring a potion with a gnarled finger, was a grotesque caricature, a deliberate distortion of the truth. But stories don't need to be literally true to serve their purpose. They only need to create fear, and fear is the best mechanism of control that has ever been invented. A chilling wind that silences dissent and keeps people in line. Slowly, over millennia, the role of the woman who possessed knowledge shifted from respected to suspect, from healer to witch, from wise woman to dangerous outsider. And it all traced back in some way to those first women on Mount Hermon, who had accepted the secrets of the Watchers. They had become the archetype of the dangerous woman, the woman who knows too much, the woman who refuses to stay in her place, who dares to challenge the patriarchal norm. A scarlet letter etched not on her chest, but on her very soul. But there was another way to view the story, a perspective that was rarely articulated, but that some marginalized voices desperately tried to preserve. What if the women who learned from the Watchers weren't the villains of the story? What if they were the first revolutionaries, the first to say, "I do not accept the role that has been assigned to me. I want more. I deserve more." Yes, the consequences had been catastrophic. The Nephilim, the flood, millions dead. The earth itself scarred by their transgression. But was it the women's fault? Or was it the fault of a system that had no space for their agency, their intellect, their very existence outside of prescribed roles? Was it the fault of the Watchers who had made promises they couldn't keep, seduced by beauty and blinded by their own desires? Was it the fault of a god who had created beings with free will and then acted surprised when they used it? These questions were dangerous, steeped in heresy and rebellion, and those who asked them aloud tended not to live very long. The fires of the Inquisition were fueled by such questions, the pyres burning bright with the bodies of those who dared to challenge the established narrative. But questions, once posed, don't simply disappear. They linger in the air, like smoke after a fire, waiting for the right moment to be picked up again, rekindled into a roaring blaze. In the 3rd century BC, a Jewish sect called the Essenes lived in the desert near the Dead Sea. Ascetics, separated from mainstream society, convinced that the world was corrupt and that only by remaining pure could they be saved when the end times arrived. They sought solace in the stark beauty of the desert, finding a strange comfort in its unforgiving landscape. Among their sacred texts, they preserved copies of the Book of Enoch. They read it as a warning, a stark reminder of what happens when you mingle with the impure, when you accept knowledge from corrupt sources, when you stray from the righteous path. The weight of its lessons pressed heavily upon them. But one of the Essene scribes, a young man named Eleazar, read the text with different eyes, a flicker of doubt in his heart. He read about the women who had loved the Watchers and wondered, did they love them back, or did they only use them? He imagined their faces, their hopes, their fears. He saw not temptresses, but individuals caught in a cosmic drama beyond their comprehension. He read about Azazel teaching cosmetics and wondered, is it really so bad that a woman wants to be beautiful? Is it vanity or is it art? Is it manipulation or is it self-expression? He questioned the very foundations of his beliefs, wrestling with concepts that threatened to unravel his carefully constructed worldview. He read about the Nephilim devouring humans and wondered, did they have a choice? Did they ask to be born? Is it fair to punish someone for the nature with which they were created? He couldn't reconcile the image of a just God with the suffering he read about in the ancient texts. Eliezer never wrote these questions in his official manuscripts. He knew he would be expelled or worse. Heresy was a dangerous game, and the Essenes were not known for their tolerance. But he wrote them in a private notebook, on brittle parchment in fading ink, hoping that maybe someday someone else would find them and continue to wonder. A secret rebellion waged in the silence of his own heart. That notebook was lost to time. Perhaps it was destroyed, consumed by the flames of intolerance. Perhaps it lies buried in some cave, waiting to be discovered by a future seeker of truth. But the questions it contained were universal, etched into the very fabric of human existence. And others, in other places, in other times, would ask the same questions. The seeds of doubt, once planted, could never be truly eradicated. Meanwhile, the spirits of the Nephilim continued to roam the earth. Not all of them were malevolent. Some were simply lost, confused, searching for something that would give meaning to an existence that should never have occurred. Fragments of their stories echoed in the winds, whispers of sorrow and regret carried across the centuries. There was a story preserved in fragments, in Gnostic texts, about a Nephilim spirit that entered a small child. The parents were terrified, their faces etched with fear. The child spoke in a deep voice, a voice that seemed to belong to someone ancient and powerful. He moved objects with his mind, a terrifying display of uncontrolled power. He knew things he shouldn't know, secrets whispered on the wind and gleamed from the hidden corners of the world. But when an exorcist came and began the ritual to expel it, something unexpected occurred. The spirit spoke, not with threats, but with supplication. Please, it said through the child's mouth, don't send me back to nothingness. Here, at least, I can feel, I can touch, I can know what it's like to be alive, even if it's through the senses of another. The exorcist hesitated, his hand trembling. It was his job to expel demons, to cleanse the world of darkness. But this didn't sound like a demon. It sounded like something tragic, like a shipwrecked sailor clinging to wreckage in the middle of the ocean. What are you? Asked the exorcist, his voice barely a whisper. I am a mistake, replied the spirit, born of a union that should never have occurred. My father was light, my mother was flesh, and I am neither. I don't belong to heaven, I don't belong to earth, I don't belong to the dead. I only exist in the margins, searching for a place where I fit. And you think that place is inside an innocent child? No, admitted the spirit, its voice heavy with sorrow. But it's the only place I've found. The exorcist closed his eyes, his brow furrowed in thought. He prayed not for divine guidance, but for wisdom, for compassion, for the ability to do the right thing when the right thing was anything but clear. He carried the weight of the decision on his shoulders, a burden almost too heavy to bear. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm but gentle. I am going to expel you, but I will not send you to nothingness. I will send you to a place where you can rest, where you can wait. And perhaps, at the end of time, when all things are judged and reconciled, you will find the place where you belong. And if that place doesn't exist? The spirit asked, its voice filled with a haunting resignation. Then at least you will have waited with hope, instead of wandering with despair. The spirit didn't respond, but when the exorcist completed the ritual, it left the child without resistance, a silent departure into the unknown. The child awoke as from a deep sleep, with no memory of what had transpired, and the exorcist never knew if he had done the right thing, or if he had simply deceived himself in order to feel better about an impossible situation. He carried the weight of his actions, forever haunted by the memory of the spirit's plea. These stories, these cracks in the official narrative, these whispers of dissent, showed something important. That even in a myth about transgression and punishment, there was room for compassion, for complexity, for doubt. And maybe, just maybe, that was the true lesson. Not that disobedience always leads to disaster, but that living means constantly navigating between what we want and what we should want, between what we feel and what we know, between desire and consequence. The Watchers didn't fall because they were evil. They fell because they were capable of desire. And desire, without wisdom, without limits, without consideration of consequences, always ends in tragedy. But the alternative, an existence without desire, without love, without the possibility of choosing wrongly, is it really life, or is it just existence? A sterile and meaningless existence devoid of passion and purpose. These are the questions that the Book of Enoch poses without answering, lingering enigmas that continue to challenge us. And perhaps that is the reason it was censored. Not because the answers were heretical, but because the questions were too uncomfortable. Because they force us to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, how different am I from a watcher? How many times have I desired something I knew was wrong? How many times have I rationalized my decisions, telling myself it was worth it? And how many times have I let others pay the price for my choices? We don't have to be fallen angels to be complicit in our own tragedies. We only have to be human with all our flaws and contradictions, our capacity for both great love and terrible cruelty. Who had dominated the world before the younger gods defeated them? Every culture had its version of the same story. Powerful beings who existed first, who were displaced, waiting in the margins for their moment to return. They were echoes, distortions, but at the core, the story remained the same, as if something in the human collective unconscious remembered, however vaguely, that there were once giants on Earth and that their disappearance wasn't natural. During the Middle Ages, when Europe plunged into centuries of relative cultural darkness, the Book of Enoch nearly vanished entirely from the Western Christian world. The monasteries that preserved ancient texts focused on the canonical Gospels, the writings of the Church Fathers, theological treatises that reinforced official doctrine. But in Ethiopia, in Orthodox monasteries built on remote mountains, monks continued to copy the Book of Enoch, with a dedication that rivaled that which they gave to Genesis or the Psalms. For them, it wasn't apocryphal. It was sacred scripture, an integral part of understanding how the world had come to be what it was. And they were right to preserve it because it contained something that the canonical texts avoided. An explanation of why the world is as it is, why there is evil, why there is suffering, why God, if he is all-powerful and benevolent, allows chaos to exist. The answer Enoch offered was uncomfortable, but honest. He gave free will to his creations. And free will, by definition, includes the capacity to choose evil, horribly evil, catastrophically evil. It was an answer that didn't solve the problem of evil, but at least acknowledged it in its full complexity. Meanwhile, in the secular world, something was changing. The Renaissance brought with it an explosion of interest in ancient texts. Italian humanists traveled to Constantinople before its fall, seeking Greek manuscripts that had been lost to the West for centuries. They rediscovered Plato, Aristotle, the dramatists and poets of antiquity. And among those texts, some scholars found references to the Book of Enoch, not the complete book, which remained exceedingly rare in Europe, but quotes and allusions in other ancient texts. Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century, mentioned it. Some of the early church fathers quoted it before it was declared non-canonical. This sparked curiosity. What did this mysterious book contain that had once been so important and then was deliberately suppressed? In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce traveled to Ethiopia. He was a man of great physical and intellectual stature, driven by the desire to discover the sources of the Nile. He envisioned the accolades, the maps bearing his name, the glory of solving a centuries-old riddle. But what he brought back to Europe was, in many ways, more significant than any geographical discovery. He brought 3 complete copies of the Book of Enoch, in the ancient Ethiopian language, intact, preserved for 1,000 years while Europe had forgotten they even existed. When it was finally translated into English in 1821, it caused a sensation in academic and theological circles. Imagine the hushed whispers in dimly lit studies, the frantic scribbling of notes as scholars devoured the long-lost text. Here was a text that Jesus and the apostles had likely known, that explained Christian doctrines about fallen angels and demons in ways that the biblical canon only hinted at, that offered a complete cosmology, rich, strange, and fascinating, but also deeply unsettling. Because if this book had been considered sacred scripture once, why was it excluded? What made it so dangerous that the church decided it was better to pretend it didn't exist? The answer lay in the questions it posed, questions about female agency, about the nature of desire, about whether knowledge could be inherently corrupt, or if it was the use we made of it that mattered, about whether God was just in punishing all of humanity for the actions of a few. These weren't questions that a hierarchical institution wanted its faithful to ask, but once the book was back in circulation, there was no way to put it back in the bottle. The genie was out, the Pandora's box open. Writers, artists, philosophers began to be fascinated with its imagery. The rebellious angels, the antediluvian giants, the flood as a direct consequence of forbidden love. It was romantic in the darkest sense of the word. It was tragedy on a cosmic scale. It was the definitive story of desire and punishment, of transgression and consequence. And it resonated powerfully in an era that was beginning to question all inherited certainties. The 19th century was a time of revolutions, political revolutions that overthrew monarchies, industrial revolutions that transformed how we worked and lived, scientific revolutions that questioned religious narratives about the origin of the world and humanity. Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, proposing that humans hadn't been created perfect in a garden, but had evolved over millions of years from simpler forms. It was an idea that scandalized many, but also liberated some. Because if we hadn't been created perfect, then the fall wasn't a fall from perfection. It was simply part of the process. Error, failure, transgression were necessary components of evolution. Without mutation, without deviation from the norm, there would be no progress. The Watchers, seen in this light, were mutants, deviations from their angelic programming. And although their experiment had been catastrophic, it had also introduced new information into the system, new potential. The daughters of men who accepted their knowledge were the first to say, "I don't accept my place in the hierarchy as inevitable. I'm going to take what I can to improve my position." It was social Darwinism before Darwin. It was feminism before the word existed. And the Nephilim, those poor hybrid monsters, were the inevitable price of experimentation. When you mix two things that were never meant to be mixed, sometimes you get something wonderful. More frequently, you get something that cannot survive, that destroys everything around it before self-destructing. These interpretations, of course, weren't the ones that conservative theologians accepted. For them, the Book of Enoch was still a simple warning. Don't disobey God, or you will be punished. End of story. But for a growing generation of thinkers who questioned authority in all its forms, religious, political, social, there were more complex lessons to be drawn. In the literary salons of Paris and London, in the universities of Heidelberg and Oxford, in the cafes of Vienna, where Freud was developing his theories about the unconscious, the Book of Enoch was read not as a religious text, but as a psychological artifact. What did it say about us that our oldest mythologies revolved around sexual transgression and divine punishment? Why did the mixing of the celestial and the terrestrial produce monsters? What did the Watchers really represent in the internal landscape of the human psyche? Freud would have said they represented the ID, the primal, instinctive impulse that seeks immediate gratification without considering consequences. The Watchers saw, desired, took, like children, like animals, like the part of us that always wants more, no matter the cost. Jung, on the other hand, would have seen in them something more archetypal. The dark sage, the light bringer who becomes Lucifer, the figure who brings liberating but also dangerous knowledge, who gives you fire, but also burns you. And the women in these stories, the daughters of men, represented the anima, the feminine aspect of the masculine unconscious that simultaneously attracts and terrifies, that promises completeness but also threatens dissolution, that is the gateway to both heaven and hell. These psychological interpretations stripped the story of its literality, but preserved its power. Because even if there were never literal angels who came down from heaven, the dynamics they described were real. The desire that ignores limits, the knowledge that corrupts as much as it illuminates, the love that destroys what it loves. We have all been watchers at some point. We have all looked at something we shouldn't have and decided to take it anyway. And we have all been the daughters of men, accepting offers that we knew would have a price, but hoping that somehow we would be the exception. And we have all been Nephilim, products of forces we don't control, acting according to natures we didn't choose, punished for being what we didn't ask to be. That universality is what kept the story alive, not as historical record, because few believed in literal angels copulating with literal women anymore, but as a mirror, as a way to understand ourselves in our darkest and most honest moments. Meanwhile, the 20th century brought its own forms of transgression. The atomic bomb was knowledge stolen from the secrets of the universe, used to create something that could destroy the world. Wasn't that exactly what Azazel had done? Take knowledge we shouldn't have and turn it into a weapon. Genetic engineering promised that soon we could create life in laboratories, mix DNA from different species, perhaps even design humans according to specifications. Wasn't that playing at being watchers, mixing what shouldn't be mixed? Artificial intelligence advanced toward the point where machines could think, feel, desire. What would happen when our creations developed free will? When they wanted things we hadn't programmed them to want? Wouldn't they be the new Nephilim? Hybrids of silicon and code, powerful beyond our capacity to control them. The story of the Watchers hadn't ended. It was simply being retold with new technology, and the questions remained the same. Is there knowledge we shouldn't seek? Are there limits we shouldn't cross? Or is it precisely crossing limits that makes us human, that distinguishes us from the animals who never question their nature? And if there are limits, who decides where they are? God, nature, society, ourselves? Because if we wait for someone else to decide for us, we abdicate the very freedom for which the Watchers fell. But if we decide for ourselves, we assume a terrifying responsibility, the responsibility of living with the consequences of our choices, without being able to blame anyone else when everything goes wrong. That's the burden of freedom. And perhaps that's why so many people throughout history have preferred obedience. It's easier, safer, more consoling. But it's also a life without fullness, without the possibility of being truly ourselves. And the Watchers, despite all their suffering, had had a moment of fullness, a moment where they were completely themselves, acting from their deepest desire, without masks or assigned roles. That moment had cost them everything, but they had had it. How many of us can say the same? As the 20th century moved toward its end, something strange began to occur with the story of the Watchers. It began to seep into popular culture in ways that would have been unthinkable centuries ago. Movies, novels, television series, video games. Suddenly, fallen angels were everywhere, not as moral warnings, but as complex, often sympathetic, sometimes even heroic characters. Lucifer was no longer simply the enemy of God. In some versions, he was the necessary rebel, the one who dared to ask why when everyone else just said yes, the lightbringer who was punished for illuminating. And the women in these modern stories were no longer passive temptresses. They were protagonists, making active choices, sometimes choosing the fallen angel precisely because he represented freedom, even if it was dangerous. Other times, they redeemed him with their love, or destroyed him with their rejection. The dynamics had changed. It was no longer a story about men acting and women being acted upon. It was a story about two beings with agency, making decisions, facing consequences together, and the public devoured it. Why? Perhaps because we lived in an era of unprecedented moral ambiguity. The simple categories of good and evil no longer worked. We had seen democratic governments do terrible things. We had seen revolutionaries with noble ideals become dictators. We had seen corporations that saved lives while destroying ecosystems. Nothing was pure. Everything was mixed, like the Nephilim, impossible hybrids that didn't fit into any clean category. And perhaps in that mixture, in that impossibility of being completely good or completely evil, we recognized ourselves. In the margins of the internet, in dark forums and specialized blogs, something unexpected emerged. A modern cult of the Watchers. It wasn't an organized religion. It had no hierarchies or fixed dogmas. It was more of a shared sensibility, a recognition that the Watchers represented something valuable, the willingness to sacrifice everything for what you desire. Some of these groups were relatively harmless, spiritual nerds exploring ancient mythology with modern eyes, but others became darker. They celebrated transgression for its own sake. They saw in Azazel not a warning, but a role model. He gave us beauty, wrote one blogger on a site dedicated to cosmetics and occultism. He gave us the power to transform ourselves, to be more than what we were born. Why should I apologize for wearing makeup? Why should I feel ashamed for wanting to be beautiful? Azazel freed me, and I'm not going to reject that gift just because some ancient priests decided it was a sin. There was something powerful in that perspective, a strange feminism that found empowerment not in rejecting traditional femininity, but in reclaiming it, in saying, yes, I paint my lips. Yes, I wear heels, but I do it for me, not for you. And that choice, that agency, that is my magic. But there was also danger in romanticizing the fall too much, because for every woman who found empowerment in the story of Azazel, there was another who used it to justify staying in toxic relationships. It's like the Watchers said. She would sigh, "Love so intense that it destroys everything. It's romantic." No, it wasn't. Love that destroys is not romantic. It's trauma disguised as destiny. And that was the perpetual danger of the story. It could be interpreted in ways that liberated or enslaved, depending on who was telling it and why. In the theological academies, a new debate emerged. Should the Book of Enoch be restored to the canon? Or at least officially recognized as a significant text for understanding the context of the New Testament? The arguments in favor were strong. Jude quoted directly from the Book of Enoch in his epistle. Peter alluded to the chained angels. Jesus spoke of demons in ways that only made sense if you knew the story of the Nephilim. It was clearly part of the conceptual world in which early Christianity had been born. The arguments against were also strong. The book contained strange cosmology, angelology that contradicted later theological developments, and, above all, those damn questions. The questions that made people doubt, that made them question, that made them think too much instead of simply believing. In the end, most denominations decided to maintain the status quo. The Book of Enoch remained apocryphal, interesting, but not authoritative, worthy of study, but not of veneration. It was a typically institutional solution. Don't completely reject something that has historical weight, but don't embrace it so strongly that it threatens the official narrative. Maintain the ambiguity, maintain control. But outside the institutions, in real life, where people grappled with impossible desires and complicated choices, the story of the Watchers continued to resonate. A woman in therapy talking about her affair. I know it's wrong. I know it. But when I'm with him, I feel something I've never felt with anyone else. It's like touching something divine. Even if it condemns me, it was worth knowing him. A scientist debating whether to publish potentially dangerous artificial intelligence research. This knowledge is going to come out eventually. If it's not me, it will be someone else. At least I can try to make sure it's used responsibly. An artist defending his provocative work that offended religious sensibilities. Art that doesn't make you uncomfortable is just decoration. My job is to ask questions that others are afraid to ask. If that makes me fallen, so be it. In each of these cases, the logic of the Watchers was present, the belief that some knowledge, some experience, some truth was so important that it justified breaking the rules, that it was worth the potential punishment. And perhaps they were right, or perhaps they were rationalizing. It's difficult to know in the moment. Only the consequences reveal whether a transgression was heroic or simply selfish. But waiting until you know the consequences means never acting. It means letting fear decide instead of conviction. So, people jumped again and again, knowing they might fall, hoping they might fly. In the depths beneath the earth, Semyaza felt each of these echoes. He couldn't intervene, he couldn't guide. He could only observe as countless generations repeated versions of his story. And slowly, after millennia of contemplation, he came to a different conclusion than the one he had held at the beginning. The problem hadn't been desire. Desire was beautiful. It was what made life worth living. The problem had been the blindness, the inability to see beyond the moment of desire, to the waves of consequences that would ripple in all directions. The Watchers had seen the women and had desired them, but they hadn't thought about the children who would be born, about the mothers who would die in childbirth, about the worlds that would be destroyed to feed those children, about the flood that would inevitably come to cleanse the mess, not because they were evil, but because they were in love. And love, in its most intense form, is the most blinding of all states. It makes you believe that only you and your beloved matter, that the rest of the world can burn while you two consume each other together. And perhaps there are moments where that love is worth every drop of destruction it causes, moments where the connection between two beings is so profound, so true, so rare that it justifies any price. But more frequently, it's just selfishness disguised as romance. It's hedonism with good advertising. It's the ID claiming that it's the heart. And distinguishing between the two in the moment is almost impossible. Only time reveals the difference. Semyaza wished he could tell this to someone, to anyone, to the humans who kept falling into the same traps, to the young lovers who believed that their love was different, special, that the rules didn't apply to them. He wanted to tell them, your love may be real and still be wrong, can be true and still be destructive. It can be the most important thing you've ever felt and still not justify the damage you will cause. But he couldn't speak. He could only wait and observe, and mentally count each repetition of his story, each small fall, each local transgression that would never reach diluvian proportions, but would leave its own scars on the fabric of the world. Above, in the world of light, the 21st century brought new forms of the fall. Social media allowed anyone to construct an idealized version of themselves, a carefully curated avatar, a digital mask that was simultaneously true and false. It was the gift of Azazel amplified 1,000 times. No longer could only the face you presented in person be transformed. Now your entire existence could be art, filter, illusion. And people became addicted to that transformation, to the likes, to the validation, to the feeling of being seen, admired, desired by thousands of strangers. It was a different kind of pact with dark forces, not with literal angels, but with algorithms, with corporations that monetized your attention, with the infinite dopamine of notifications that never fully satisfied, but also never let you go. The new Nephilim weren't giants of flesh. They were influencers, personalities constructed to be larger than life, consuming emotional and financial resources from millions of followers, growing until they became monsters in their influence, and eventually, inevitably collapsing under the weight of their own contradictions, when the mask cracked and the person beneath was revealed as painfully, disappointingly human. And the world kept turning, the patterns kept repeating, and the Book of Enoch, preserved on parchment and paper for millennia, now existed also as bits and bytes, ones and zeros, accessible to anyone with an internet connection, more available than ever and perhaps for the first time, ready to be understood, not as a warning, but as a mirror, as a way to see ourselves in all our contradictory complexity, not as angels, not as demons, but as what we have always been, beings, capable of the sublime and the terrible, often at the same time, trying to navigate between desire and wisdom, without map or guide, only with the stories of those who fell before and hoping perhaps that this time will be different, although probably not. There is a moment in every night, just before the dawn, when the darkness is deepest. The ancients called it the hour of the wolf. It is when the sick most often die, when doubts weigh heaviest, when demons, both literal and metaphorical, have the most power. And it is in those hours when the oldest stories return to us with greatest clarity. Perhaps because in the darkness, without the distractions of the day, we can hear what has always been whispering beneath the surface of our consciousness. The questions we avoid when there is light enough to see us occupied with things that seem more urgent. What would I do in the place of the Watchers? If I saw something so beautiful, so impossible to attain according to the rules I'd been given, would I have the courage to fall for it? Or the cowardice to stay where I am, safe but incomplete? And what would I do in the place of the daughters of men? If a being of incommensurable power offered me knowledge, beauty, the capacity to transcend my limitations, would I say no? Could I say no? Or would the curiosity, the hunger to be more, be too strong? These are not hypothetical questions. We face them constantly, just in smaller, more mundane versions. Every time we consider an affair that might destroy our marriage but promises to make us feel alive again. Every time we contemplate taking a shortcut that we know is unethical but that would get us closer to our goals. Every time we look at something forbidden, be it knowledge, experience, or person, and feel that magnetic pull that says, "Take me. I am worth the price." We are all in those moments watchers in miniature, standing on the edge, calculating, rationalizing, searching for a way to have what we want without paying what it costs. And generally, if we are honest, we know what our choice will be before we make it. The deliberation is just theater, a way of telling ourselves that we considered the consequences when in reality we had already decided. Because desire, when it is strong enough, is not debated. It is executed. And then, only afterward, when the consequences begin to manifest, comes the regret, or the justification, or both alternating in endless waves. The Watchers had millennia to repent, and according to some texts, some of them did. Not Samjaza, not Azazel. They maintained their conviction even in chains. But others, the weaker ones, or perhaps the wiser, crumbled under the weight of guilt. "Why didn't I resist?" they lamented in the darkness of their prisons. "A moment of pleasure for an eternity of torment. How could I be so stupid?" But even they, in their most honest moments, had to admit, if they could go back, with all the knowledge they now possessed of the consequences, they probably would do the same thing. Because desire doesn't function with logic. It functions with its own mathematics, where a moment of true connection is worth infinitely more than eons of empty existence. That is the madness and the beauty of desire, that it can make you value the ephemeral over the eternal, the impossible over the secure, the flame that burns you over the cold ashes that leave you untouched. And the women, the daughters of men who accepted the forbidden knowledge. Did they repent? The ancient texts do not give them a voice. They die in the flood without leaving a testament. We can only imagine. Some surely repented bitterly as they watched their children turn into monsters, as they felt their bodies destroyed by impossible pregnancies, as the water rose and they knew they were going to die for having desired something more. But others, perhaps, maintained their conviction until the end. I learned to read the stars. One might have thought as the water covered her mouth. I knew the beauty of my own transformed face. I loved a being of light. I lived more in 20 years than many do in 80. And if the price is to die now, at least I lived. We don't know. We cannot know. Their voices were erased by the flood as completely as their bodies. And perhaps that is part of the punishment, not only to die but to be forgotten, to be reduced to a role in someone else's story, to be the women who tempted the angels instead of people with names, dreams, fears, hopes of their own. That is the silent injustice that runs through all of history. The Watchers, at least, are remembered. They have names, identities, specific roles. Samjaza, Azazel, Barakel. We know them, but the women are anonymous. The daughters of men, a generic, interchangeable group, as if they didn't matter except as objects of desire and recipients of consequences. And that pattern repeats itself throughout history. The men who fall are tragic. The women who accompany them in the fall are accessories, or worse, are blamed for the fall itself. But in recent centuries, something has begun to change. Women have begun to reclaim their own narratives, to tell their own versions of the story, and in those versions, things look different. In the version of a 21st century feminist writer, the daughters of men were not passive victims or evil temptresses. They were active agents of their own destiny. They were given an opportunity to learn, to grow, to transcend the limitations that patriarchal society had imposed on them, and they took it. Yes, the consequences were terrible. But what was the alternative? To live a whole life within limits defined by others. To never know what they were capable of, to die eventually anyway, but without having tasted knowledge, power, beauty? In this reading, the Watchers were not seducers. They were co-conspirators, collaborators in a mutual experiment of transgression. And the flood was not a just punishment, but a supreme patriarchal reaction. When women become too powerful, too knowledgeable, too beautiful, too autonomous, the entire system drowns them and starts over with a more controllable model. It is a reading that makes many uncomfortable, that they accuse of being historical revisionism, of projecting modern concerns onto ancient texts, and they are right to some extent. We are reading our own anxieties into stories written millennia ago. But haven't all generations done that? Isn't that exactly why stories survive? Because they are rich enough, complex enough, ambiguous enough to be reinterpreted according to the needs of each era. Medieval monks read the Book of Enoch and saw warnings about celibacy and purity. 19th-century romantics saw sublime tragedy and love beyond reason. 20th-century scientists saw metaphors of pollution, genetics, and eugenics. And we, in the 21st century, see questions of consent, female agency, and the dangers of systems that punish transgression more severely than they reward obedience. All these readings are valid, and none is complete. Because the story is larger than any individual interpretation. It contains multitudes. It can be simultaneously about true love and selfish desire, about female liberation and exploitation, about the beauty of knowledge and its dangers, about divine justice and cosmic authoritarianism. It can be all of that at the same time, and it is precisely that multiplicity that keeps it alive. Think of this as you curl up deeper into the darkness, as your eyelids grow heavy, as the story continues to flow around you like warm water. The watchers remain chained. They have been there for what, to them, must feel like eternities stacked upon eternities, and they will remain there until the end of time, according to prophecy. But what does the end of time really mean? Is it a future event, or is it a state of consciousness? The moment when we finally understand that time itself is an illusion, that everything is happening simultaneously, that the fall and the redemption are the same events seen from different angles. Perhaps the watchers have already been freed, or perhaps they never fell. Perhaps the entire drama is a way of explaining something more fundamental. The eternal tension between order and chaos, between obeying our nature and transcending it, between being what we are and becoming what we could be. That tension is never resolved. It cannot be resolved. It is the basic condition of conscious existence. And perhaps, just perhaps, the watchers knew it. Perhaps their fall was not an accident or a transgression, but a service. Someone had to demonstrate that it was possible to choose, that free will was not just an abstract concept, but a real capacity with real consequences. Someone had to fall first so that the rest would know that falling was possible. And once you know it's possible, you are no longer trapped. You can choose to fall or not to fall, but it is a choice, not destiny. That is the true freedom, and it has a terrible price. The watchers paid it. The daughters of men paid it. The Nephilim paid it. Millions of humans paid it in the flood. But thanks to that price, we now know that we can choose. Is it worth it? There is no universal answer to that question. Each one must answer it for themselves, and the answer will change depending on the day, the mood, the phase of the moon, how much you have slept, whom you have loved recently, what you have lost. But the question remains, waiting patiently, eternally, like the watchers in their chains, like the women whose voices were drowned, like the spirits of the Nephilim wandering formlessly through a world that was never meant to contain them. All waiting, all asking, all incomplete. And you too, listening to this story in the darkness, feeling it resonate in places within you that perhaps you didn't know existed, because part of you is watcher, part of you is daughter of men, part of you is Nephilim. We are all impossible hybrids, mixtures of desire and duty, of flesh and aspiration, trying to find our place in a world that asks us to be simpler than we really are. So sleep now if you can. The story will still be here when you wake. It has always been here. It will always be here. Because the true stories, the ones that touch something real in us, do not end. They only pause, waiting for the next listener, the next dreamer, the next person brave or foolish enough to wonder what I would have done on Mount Hermon that night when the angels decided to descend. Sometime in the early hours, when sleep and wakefulness blur into that uncertain territory where stories are more real than reality itself, it's worth asking, what really happened to the souls of those first women? The texts don't say. The Book of Enoch ends with the flood and their monster children. The flood erases everything, and afterwards the story continues with Noah and his descendants as if the previous generations had never existed. But souls don't just disappear because water covers them. At least that's what many traditions believe. So where did they go? There's a legend that never entered any canonical text, circulating only in the margins, in whispers among mystics and dreamers. It says that the women who loved the Watchers were taken to a special place. Not heaven because they had transgressed. Not hell because they had not been evil. But a third place, an in-between place, a kind of purgatory before that concept was formalized. A space where they could wait, reflect, be judged, not by absolute rules but by context, by intention, by what was in their hearts when they accepted the forbidden knowledge. In this place, which some called the Garden of Lost Hopes, the women could finally speak, could tell their own versions of what had happened, and discover that each one had a different story. Leora, who had died giving birth to her Nephilim son, spoke of true love. Erekiel taught me to read the stars, she said in a soft but firm voice. But more than that, he taught me that my mind mattered, that my questions had value, that I wasn't here only to bear children and grind grain. Yes, I died, and yes, my son was a monster, but during the years I had with Erekiel, I was more myself than I had ever been. Another woman, whose name had been lost, even there had a darker story. I was deceived, she admitted. The Watcher who chose me promised eternal love. He promised that we would be like gods together. But when I became pregnant and my body began to tear apart, he disappeared. He returned to the mountains, left me alone with the pain, and when my son was born and began to devour everything around him, the father did nothing to control him. So no, it wasn't love. It was selfishness disguised as destiny. And there were more, as many stories as women. Some of mutual love that had been true but impossible, others of seduction and abandonment, some of curiosity that had become obsession, others of hope that had been transformed into despair. There was no single narrative, and perhaps that was the most important thing of all. They were not the daughters of men as a homogeneous group. They were individuals with different experiences, different choices, different regrets. And in that in-between garden, they finally had space to be seen as such. But this is only legend, fiction within fiction. A story that someone invented to give these nameless women the closure that the ancient texts denied them. It's true, probably not in a literal sense, but literal truths are not the only ones that matter. Sometimes emotional truths, narrative truths, truths that help to heal something broken in the collective psyche are more important. And the emotional truth here is simple. Women deserve to be heard. Their perspectives matter. And any story that turns them into accessories or villains without giving them agency and voice is incomplete. That is what modern reinterpretations attempt to correct. Not to erase the original story, but to complete it, to add the dimensions that were always missing. Meanwhile, in the physical world where you rest now, the consequences of that ancient transgression continue to manifest in subtle ways. Every time a woman looks in the mirror and decides that she is not enough without transformation. Every time the beauty industry generates billions selling the promise of transcendence through products. Every time someone confuses love with obsession, because the stories we have been told romanticize intensity over health. The Watchers disappeared from the stage long ago, but their teachings remain, filtered through millennia, distorted, but recognizable, and they are not entirely bad. Makeup can be art, jewelry can be cultural expression. The knowledge of herbs saved lives for centuries before modern medicine existed. Swords, although they are weapons, also protected the weak from predators. The problem was never knowledge itself. It was the context in which it was given. It was the mixture of unequal power with desire. It was humanity's lack of preparation to handle those secrets responsibly. If the Watchers had waited, if they had taught gradually, generation after generation, allowing humanity to evolve alongside the knowledge. If they had not mixed education with seduction, gift with obligation, then perhaps things would have been different. But they did not wait, and the story we have is the one we have, with all its pain and beauty intertwined so closely that it is impossible to separate them. And that is a perfect metaphor for the human condition, isn't it? Everything meaningful in our lives comes mixed. Love with fear of loss, achievement with sacrifice, knowledge with responsibility, pleasure with consequences. Nothing is pure. Everything is hybrid, like the Nephilim. Powerful and broken, magnificent and monstrous, too large for the world that contained them. Sometimes, on very dark nights, people say that they can still hear the groans of the Nephilim. Not physically, but on some deeper level, like a frequency that vibrates just below the threshold of normal consciousness. It is the sound of something that should never have existed, desperately trying to find its place. Of something too large to fit, too powerful to be ignored, but too unnatural to be accepted. And if you listen carefully, perhaps you will recognize that sound, because we have all felt it at some point, that feeling of not fitting in, of being too much for some contexts and not enough for others, of having a hunger that cannot be satiated with the normal things that satiate other people. That is our inner Nephilim, the part of us that is hybrid, that is not completely from here or from there, that is constantly seeking something more without knowing exactly what. And the question that each one must answer is, what do I do with that hunger? Do I feed it and let it grow until it devours everything around me? Do I deny it and try to live as if I were simpler than I am? Or do I find some middle path, some way to honor my hybrid nature without letting it destroy me or destroy others? There is no easy answer. The Nephilim never found it. They simply consumed until they were consumed by the flood. But we have something they did not have: time to learn, generations of cautionary tales, the example of what not to do. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is enough for some of us to find a different path. A path where hunger is recognized but not allowed to dominate, where desire is honored but balanced with wisdom, where transgression, when it occurs, is at least conscious, with eyes open, with acceptance of consequences. That would be a different kind of fall, not blind, like that of the Watchers, but intentional, chosen, with full understanding of the price. And perhaps those intentional falls are different. Perhaps they have meaning in ways that the blind ones do not. Perhaps they are how we evolve, how we grow, how we become more complete versions of ourselves. Or perhaps I am rationalizing. Perhaps every fall is simply a fall, destructive, avoidable, regrettable. I don't know the answer, and I suspect that no one really knows it. We can only live our lives as best we can, making decisions that we hope are right, and dealing with the consequences when we discover that they were not. That is what it means to be human. Not to be perfect, not to be always right, but to be capable of choosing, of failing, of learning, of trying again. The Watchers never had that second chance. Once they fell forever, chained in the darkness until the end of time. But we, the humans, have something more flexible, more generous. We have the capacity to fall and get up, to fail and be forgiven, to transgress and be redeemed. Not always, not everyone, but enough so that there is hope. And hope, however fragile, is what distinguishes us from the Nephilim. They were too powerful to wait. They took what they wanted when they wanted it, and that destroyed them. We are weaker, but in that weakness there is a kind of grace, because we know that we cannot have it all, that we have to choose, that each choice closes other doors, and in those limitations we find meaning. The Watchers sought to transcend limitations and lost everything. Perhaps true wisdom is not to transcend, but to accept. To work within limits instead of breaking them. To find freedom not in limitless chaos, but in conscious choice within structure. Or perhaps not. Perhaps I am being too conservative, too careful. Perhaps true life requires breaking rules, not just bending them. As I said, I don't have the answers. I only have the story. And the story is rich enough to support multiple interpretations. So take from it what you need, and leave the rest for others to find when their time comes. Because that is the power of ancient stories. They don't give us answers. They give us mirrors. And what we see in them depends on who we are when we look. There's a particular tranquility in the deepest hours of the night, when the world, as the exterior world grows so quiet, you can hear the thrum of your own pulse. The day's anxieties dissolve into something more primal, more fundamental, like sediment settling in a still pond. Then, the ancient stories cease being mere history and become a living presence. It's in these moments that the boundaries between then and now feel less solid, less defined than we often believe. Time isn't a straight line marching forward, but a circle, perhaps a spiral, where the same patterns return again and again. Each iteration is a familiar echo, yet subtly altered, playing out on a slightly different level. The Watchers fell from grace driven by desire, and we continue to fall, though now our descents are more contained, more dispersed. Instead of one cataclysmic deluge that erases everything, we experience 1,000 tiny, personal floods. Marriages founder, careers sink, versions of ourselves must die so that new versions can emerge, phoenix-like, from the ashes. And maybe that's a better way, a more sustainable path, because a global apocalypse is a trauma no one could ever fully process. But these smaller deaths and rebirths, these are manageable. We can integrate them into the tapestry of our lives. Consider someone who has lived a long life, 80, 90 years. They've been so many different people in that time. The child they were, wide-eyed with wonder. The rebellious teenager pushing against boundaries. The young adults searching for their place in the world. The established professional. The reflective elder looking back at the winding road they traveled. Each transition, a miniature death. One version of you must end, must be laid to rest, so that the next can begin, can breathe. And if you cling too tightly to who you were, if you refuse to fall towards who you could be, you become stuck, petrified, alive but not growing. The Watchers refused to stay where they were and paid a terrible price. But at least they tried. At least they chose movement over stasis, change over a gilded cage of safety. There is something admirable in that audacious reach, even when the result is disastrous, because the alternative, remaining eternally the same, is its own kind of death. A slower, colder death, but just as final. Mystical traditions across cultures speak of something called the dark night of the soul. It's when everything you thought you knew about yourself unravels. The carefully constructed structures of meaning you built collapse, leaving you exposed and raw. You find yourself adrift in a void where the old truths no longer work, no longer resonate, but the new ones haven't yet arrived. It's terrifying, disorienting, like losing your footing on a familiar path. Some don't survive that crucible intact, but those who do emerge transformed. More complete, more authentic, more truly themselves than they had ever been before. It's a type of personal flood where the waters cover everything familiar. You must find your arc, your way to preserve what is essential while allowing the inessential to be washed away, carried out to sea. And the question each person in that process must answer is the same one the Watchers faced. What am I willing to sacrifice? What is so essential that it must be preserved, no matter the cost? And what can I let go of, even though it hurts, because deep down I know it's holding me back? There are no universal answers to be found. Each of us must decide for ourselves what belongs on the ark and what is left outside to drown. Sometimes we choose poorly. We preserve things we should have let go of, or we let go of things that turn out to be more important than we thought. Then we have to live with those choices, or find ways to correct them if that's even possible. But at least we chose. That has to count for something. Somewhere, in the liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, you can catch a glimpse if you look with the right kind of eyes. Not physical eyes, but the perception that emerges when the everyday self loosens its grip, when the defenses come down, when you are more permeable, more receptive to the whispers of the universe. You can see the threads that connect all the stories. The Book of Enoch to Genesis to Gilgamesh to Greek myth to Norse legends to fairy tales to modern films to your own recurring dreams. They all speak to the same fundamental pattern. Someone crosses a boundary, a line is breached, something new enters the world. There are consequences, there is transformation, and eventually there is a new equilibrium, different from the one that came before. Perhaps better, perhaps worse, but definitely different. It's the pattern of growth, of evolution, of life itself. Because life isn't static. Can't be. Stasis is death. Only dead things remain perfectly the same. Living things change. They grow, they adapt, they constantly transgress their own previous limitations. A seed has to break its shell to become a plant. A caterpillar has to completely dissolve in the chrysalis before emerging as a butterfly. A baby has to leave the safety of the womb to be born into the world. Each of these is a type of fall, a letting go of the safe and known for the uncertain and unknown. And each is necessary. Perhaps the Watchers were simply that. A necessary step in the evolution of consciousness, a pivotal turning point where the universe became more complex, more nuanced, more interesting. Yes, it was painful. Yes, there were losses. But when are there not, when something truly new enters the world? And what entered was the possibility of conscious choice. Not just instinct, not just obedience, but the ability to stand at a crossroads, to see clearly the options and their probable consequences, and still choose the path that calls to something deeper than reason. That's what the Watchers did, and that's what we do every time we choose love over safety, truth over convenience, growth over comfort, authenticity over approval. It doesn't always turn out well. Sometimes we regret our choices, but at least we lived, at least we moved, at least we tried. And in the grand scheme of things, maybe that's enough. Think of all the people who have lived perfect lives according to external standards, who never broke rules, who did what was expected, who remained safe and respectable and appropriate. And then think of how many of them, on their deathbeds, have regrets. Not for what they did, but for what they didn't do. For the risks they didn't take. For the loves they rejected for being unwise. For the adventures they avoided for being irresponsible. For the versions of themselves they never explored out of fear. The Watchers didn't die with those regrets. They died, or rather were chained, with the full knowledge of what they had done. And despite the price, they don't seem to regret it. At least not Semyaza, not Asakassel. They maintained their conviction even in eternal punishment. There is something deeply human in that, in saying, "This was mine. This choice, this transgression, this desire. And though it cost me everything, it was mine, it was real, and I wouldn't change it." Not all of us can say that. Many of us live lives of compromise, of gradual surrender, of dreams abandoned so slowly that we barely notice when they're gone. There is no judgment in this. It's simply observation. Life is hard, responsibilities are real. Not everyone can afford to fall for their desires. But perhaps in these dark hours before dawn, we can at least acknowledge what we have sacrificed. We can honor it. We can feel the weight of the paths not taken without letting that weight crush us. Because part of wisdom is knowing you can't have everything. That every choice excludes other choices. That every door you walk through closes other doors behind you. The Watchers wanted to have it all. They wanted heaven and earth, eternity and the moment, duty and desire. And they discovered too late that some things are mutually exclusive. We have the advantage of their example. We can see the price of wanting too much, of being unwilling to choose, of trying to break the fundamental laws of reality because they seem unfair. And perhaps we can make wiser choices, not perfect, never perfect, but more conscious, more intentional, with greater acceptance of the limitations that define what it means to be finite. Or perhaps not. Maybe each generation has to learn the same lessons for itself. Maybe there are no shortcuts to growth. Maybe you have to fall to understand what it means to fly. In any case, the story continues. Like water that keeps flowing long after the flood has subsided. Like wind that keeps blowing through the mountains where the Watchers once stood. Like your breath now, soft and steady. As you sink deeper into that borderland where stories and dreams mingle. Where the mythical past and the personal present touch. Where perhaps, just perhaps, you can hear the echo of very ancient voices whispering something that has always been true. That love, in all its forms, implies risk. That knowledge, however valuable, always changes the one who possesses it. That real or created beauty has power, and that power must be handled with care, or it will destroy both the possessor and those around them. These truths are as old as the mountains and will remain true long after the mountains have eroded into dust. But for now, in this moment, they are just soft murmurs, distant, like waves on a far-off shore. And you can let them be. You can let them wash over you and around you without resistance. Because you don't have to solve anything tonight. You don't have to understand everything. You don't have to make grand decisions or deep commitments. You just have to be here breathing, listening, allowing the story to do what stories do. To weave itself subtly into the silent spaces of your mind. In the silence that follows the great stories, there is space. A space where the words have been exhausted, but the meaning still reverberates. Where we are no longer telling the story, but living inside it. Habitating it like an ancient temple where every stone holds a memory. And in that space, if you are still enough, you can feel the presence of all those who came before. The unnamed women who loved angels, the giants who didn't ask to be born, the sages who preserved the texts when everyone else wanted to burn them, the dreamers who saw in these stories not warnings, but possibilities. All of them are here with you now, not as ghosts, but as resonances, as the way a bell keeps vibrating long after the hammer struck it. You are part of a conversation that began millennia ago and will continue long after your bones have turned to dust. A conversation about what it means to be human, about boundaries and when to respect them and when to transgress them, about desire and its beauty and its danger, about love that elevates and love that destroys, and how sometimes they are the same love, seen from different angles. This conversation has no end. Can't have an end, because each new generation brings new contexts, new questions, new ways of being that the ancients never imagined. And that's okay. That's how it should be. Stories aren't prisons. They aren't here to trap us in ancient ways of thinking. They are here as seeds, as cultural DNA that contains information but that expresses itself differently depending on the environment where it grows. The Book of Enoch. It has been sleeping in the earth for thousands of years, and each era that discovers it waters it with its own rains, illuminates it with its own sun, and something new grows. Something that honors the root, but that blossoms according to its own design. Perhaps in your life something from this story will take root. Not the literal story of angels and giants, but the pattern beneath the pattern, the archetype. The truth the story is trying to convey beyond the words. Perhaps you will find yourself at a crossroads looking at something you desire, but that you know will change everything. And you will remember the watchers, not to imitate them, but to have more awareness than they did, to see more clearly, to choose with more open eyes. Or perhaps you will find yourself being judged for choices you made. And you will remember the daughters of men, how they were blamed, how their voices were silenced. And you will ask yourself, am I blaming others for my own part in this story? Am I really listening, or just confirming what I already decided to believe? Or perhaps you will find yourself feeling like you don't fit in, that you are too much for some spaces and not enough for others. And you will remember the Nephilim, how they were punished for a nature they never chose. And perhaps you will find compassion for yourself. And perhaps you will stop trying to fit in and start creating your own space. These are the gifts that ancient stories can give. Not answers, but mirrors, maps, company on the journey. And the journey continues, always continues. After the flood came reconstruction. Slow, painful, but inevitable, because life finds ways, it always finds ways. After the scattering of Babel came diversity, cultures blossoming in 1,000 different directions, each creating its own beauty, its own wisdom, its own mistakes. And after each personal fall, each little flood in our individual lives, something new comes too, not always better but different. And in that difference, there is possibility. The watchers will never have their second chance. They are chained until the end of time. It's their tragedy, but it's also their legacy, because their fall opened doors that cannot be closed. It introduced possibilities that cannot be withdrawn. Thanks to them, we know that celestial beings can love, that knowledge can be transmitted, that the boundaries between the worlds are more permeable than the authorities want to admit. And thanks to the women who loved them, we know that the desire for transcendence isn't just masculine or celestial. That everyone, regardless of gender or position, wants to be more than they are. We want to know the forbidden. We want to touch the impossible. We want to transform ourselves into something greater, more beautiful, more powerful. That desire is dangerous, can lead us to dark places, can make us harm ourselves and others. But it's also the engine of all progress, of all art, of all exploration, of everything that makes life worth more than mere survival. So we can't simply condemn it, but neither can we blindly celebrate it. We have to hold both truths at the same time. That transgression is necessary for growth, and that transgression without wisdom is a catastrophe waiting to happen. It's an impossible tension to resolve. And maybe it's not supposed to be resolved. Maybe we're supposed to live in that tension, to hold it consciously, to develop the capacity to contain contradictions without collapsing. That's spiritual maturity, not certainty, not purity, but the ability to be complex, to contain light and darkness, to recognize the watcher and the human within you, to honor both without letting either dominate completely. And as you rest here in the stillness of this night that is slowly approaching dawn, you can feel that complexity within yourself. The parts that want to fly and the parts that want to stay on solid ground. The parts that yearn for transgression and the parts that value safety. The parts that want to be seen and the parts that want to hide. All of these parts are valid, all have their place. And the wisdom is not to eliminate the ones we don't like, but to learn to direct them all, like a conductor directs an orchestra, giving each its moment, allowing each voice to be heard, but maintaining an overall harmony that is greater than any individual instrument. That's what the Watchers couldn't do. They allowed themselves to be completely dominated by a single note: desire. And that note, however beautiful, became discordant when there was nothing to balance it. We have the opportunity to do better, not because we're purer or stronger, but because we have their story. We have the example of what doesn't work. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can ask for, to learn from the mistakes of others so we don't have to commit them all ourselves, even though we will surely commit many of our own, because that's part of the deal of being alive, of having free will. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to fall. You're going to hurt others and yourself. You're going to take the forbidden fruit again and again in 1,000 different ways. But you're also going to get up. You're going to learn. You're going to ask for forgiveness and to forgive. You're going to find ways to live with the consequences of your choices. You're going to build new lives on the ruins of the old ones. And eventually, if you live long enough and pay attention long enough, maybe you will find something that resembles wisdom. Not the wisdom that avoids all mistakes, but the wisdom that knows how to work with them. How to turn the fall into a foundation. How to use the scars as maps. How to transform regret into compassion. That's redemption, not returning to a state of innocence, but moving forward into a state of greater understanding, of greater capacity to hold the complexity of existence without breaking. And somewhere, in the depths of the earth where the Watchers are chained, perhaps they too are learning this. Perhaps after millennia of forced reflection, some of them are arriving at a place of peace. Not justification for what they did, but acceptance. Understanding that they were part of a larger process, that their fall, however painful, had a purpose. Not the purpose they imagined, but one more subtle, more grand. The purpose of demonstrating that even perfect beings can choose, and that capacity for choice, with all its dangers, is sacred. More sacred, perhaps, than perfect obedience. Because obedience without the possibility of disobedience isn't virtue. It's just programming. And God, or the universe, or reality, or whatever you want to call it, apparently valued choice enough to allow it to exist, even knowing it would be used poorly, even knowing it would cause suffering. Because without choice there is no real love, no real growth, no real meaning. There are only puppets acting out a script. And that isn't life, it's theater. Life is this disorder, this complexity, this pain and this beauty mixed so completely that you can't have one without the other. And the Watchers, with their impossible transgression and their catastrophic consequences, showed us that. They showed us what was at stake. They showed us that our choices matter, that they have weight, that they can change worlds. That's terrifying, but it's also what makes life worthwhile. Because if nothing you do really matters, then what's the point? But if everything matters, if every choice sends ripples through the fabric of reality, then every moment is significant. Every choice is sacred. Even the bad ones, especially the bad ones. Because they are the ones that teach us the most, the ones that force us to grow, the ones that make us more completely human. And that, in the end, is the true gift of this ancient story. Not a list of rules to follow, not a simple warning about sin and punishment, but a reminder of what is at stake every time we choose, of how much power we have, of how much responsibility comes with that power, and that despite everything, it's worth it. The choice is worth it, the risk is worth it. Life, with all its impossible complexity, is worth it. The Watchers fell, but they also loved. And in that love, however brief, however destructive, there was something true, something that cannot be erased, something that still resonates in every heart that dares to desire more than it has. That's their legacy, and it's ours too. And now, as the night reaches its deepest point, that moment just before the first light of dawn begins to filter over the horizon, we come to the end of this story. Or perhaps not the end, but simply a pause. Because stories like this never really end. They only transform. They are passed from one voice to another, from one generation to the next, from one form to another. Imagine for a moment that you are floating, not in water, but in something softer, in the space between thoughts, in that place where the worries of the day cannot. Not only have yesterday's worries failed to reach you, but tomorrow's anxieties have yet to arrive. There exists only this singular moment, this breath, the stillness. And within this profound stillness, you can sense the presence of all those who have ever listened to this very tale. The scribes who meticulously copied it by hand onto delicate parchments, their fingers stained with ink, laboring by the flickering candlelight in dimly lit caves. Imagine their dedication, their lives devoted to preserving these words, each stroke of the quill a testament to the story's enduring power. The mothers who whispered it to their daughters, both as a warning and a promise. Their voices, soft yet firm, weaving the narrative into the fabric of their daughters' understanding of the world, a legacy of caution and hope passed down through generations. The philosophers who debated its meaning in perfumed gardens beneath the Mediterranean stars. Picture them, lounging on marble benches, their voices rising and falling in animated discussion, dissecting every nuance and symbol, searching for timeless truths within the ancient words. The mystics who meditated upon it in silence, seeking within its symbols the keys to deeper mysteries. See them in their secluded chambers, eyes closed, minds open, delving into the hidden layers of meaning, hoping to unlock the secrets of the universe contained within the story's enigmatic core. All of them are here, not physically, but woven into the very fabric of the story itself. For every time a story is told, each person who encounters it leaves a part of themselves within it, an interpretation, an emphasis, an emotion. And all of this accumulates, layer upon layer, until the story becomes something living, something that breathes, something that grows. And now you are a part of that chain. You have listened, you have felt, and something within you has shifted, even if only subtly. Perhaps you won't even notice it until days, weeks, or even years from now, when you find yourself in a particular situation and suddenly recall the watchers, the daughters of men, the flood that cleansed but did not resolve, the pattern that repeats itself because it is a part of who we are. And in that moment of remembering, the story will have fulfilled its purpose. Not to provide easy answers, but to offer a lens through which to view your own life with greater clarity. Somewhere deep underground, in a place so profound that even starlight cannot penetrate, Semyaza senses a change. Not in his chains, which remain as steadfast as ever, but in something more subtle, in the very quality of time itself. After countless millennia, he has arrived at an understanding. Not of justification, not of being right, but of acceptance. His fall, with all its pain and all its destruction, was also his greatest act of love. Not just love for Istar, although that was real, but love for possibility itself. For freedom, for the ability to choose the difficult path, because your heart calls you toward it, even when your mind warns against it. He fell so that others would know that falling was possible, so that obedience would no longer be the only option, so that free will would cease to be an abstract concept and become a lived reality. And yes, the price was almost infinite, but the gift was also immense. There is no perfect justice in this conclusion. There is no neat resolution because life simply doesn't work that way. Only simple stories have clean endings where everything is resolved and everyone gets what they deserve. True stories, the ones that touch something real, end in ambiguity, in unresolved tension, in questions that remain open. Was it worth it? It depends on who you ask and when and in what frame of mind they happen to be when you ask. The mothers who died giving birth to monsters would say no. The humans who were devoured would say no. Noah, gazing out upon an empty world, would likely say no. But Semyaza, even in chains, and Asassel, even in punishment. And yes, some of the women they loved and who learned and were transformed, even knowing how it would end, would say, it was worth it for that moment of being truly alive, of feeling something larger than ourselves, of touching, even briefly, the impossible. And both answers are true. That is the paradox. Horror and beauty are simultaneously real, and we must be large enough to contain them both. Outside, the sky begins to change. You cannot see it yet, but it is happening. The absolute black is becoming, almost imperceptibly, a softer shade, a deep navy blue, like the color of dreams just before waking. Soon there will be light. Soon the day will begin with all its demands and distractions. And this story will slip into the background of your mind, stored, but not forgotten, awaiting the moment when you need it again. Because you will need it. We all do. We need reminders that we are more complex than we pretend to be, that our desires are deeper, that our choices carry more weight, that life is stranger, more dangerous, and more beautiful than we admit in polite conversation. We need stories that remind us that angels can fall, that mortals can ascend, that monsters are sometimes born of love, that the flood that destroys also cleanses, that the end of the world is not the end of possibility. And above all, we need to remember that we are not alone in our complexity, that thousands of generations before us struggled with the same tensions. Desire versus duty, safety versus freedom, what we are versus what we could be. And that they survived. And so will we, perhaps not intact, perhaps scarred, perhaps having lost things we cannot recover, but we will keep moving forward because that is what humans do. They fall, they rise, they fall again, they rise again, and slowly, over time, they learn to fall with more grace, to rise more quickly, to choose their falls with more wisdom. Not perfection, never perfection, but progress, slow, painful, but real. And somewhere, in the place where souls go when their stories end, the unnamed women finally rest. No longer blamed, no longer silenced, but honored as what they were. Pioneers, daring. The first to say yes when offered forbidden knowledge. The first to choose transformation over safety. They paid for that choice, but they also lived because of it. And that has to count. And the Nephilim, those impossible hybrids, those creatures who should never have existed, but existed nonetheless, also find peace. Not justification, but recognition that they did not ask to be born, that they did what they could with a nature that no one explained to them how to handle, that they were victims as much as perpetrators. And perhaps in the great final reckoning, when all accounts are settled and all stories are told in full, that will be enough. Not to erase the damage, but to contextualize it, to understand it, to learn from it. Because that is the point of stories. They are not an escape from reality, they are the way we process reality, the way we take the chaos of lived experience and give it shape, meaning, patterns that we can recognize and learn from. And this pattern, the pattern of the Watchers, is one of the oldest and one of the most important, because it speaks to something fundamental. That love and desire are forces so powerful that they can cause even perfect beings to choose imperfection, that knowledge is both a curse and a blessing, that transgression is sometimes necessary for growth, and that the consequences, however terrible they may be, do not negate the value of the act. Live with that as you can. Sleep with it if you can. And when you awaken, when the daylight makes these ideas seem strange and distant, remember, they were real in the night, and the night will return. And with it, all the questions that the daylight allows us to avoid. But for now, rest. Let the story settle within you like sediment at the bottom of an invisible river, unseen from the surface, but changing the composition of the water, making it richer, more fertile, more capable of sustaining life. The Watchers fell long ago, but their fall still resonates. In every difficult choice, in every impossible love, in every moment where you have to decide between what is safe and what is true. And when you face those moments, and you will face them, you will have this story. Not as a map, not as an instruction manual, but as company, as evidence that others faced these dilemmas before you, and that whatever happens, you are not alone. You never were alone. The story continues. It always has continued, it will always continue. But for this night, for these last hours before dawn, you can rest. And you too sleep now. The angels and their mortal lovers will still be here when you awaken. The questions will remain, the mystery will endure. But for now, in this moment of perfect stillness, none of those things needs to be resolved. It only needs to be recognized, honored, and then gently let go, like a sigh that fades into silence, like a wave returning to the ocean, like a story that ends not with a period, but with an ellipsis, inviting you to dream your own continuation, to live your own version, to find in your own life the echoes of this ancient transgression, and to see. Can you see? Any new form of redemption? May your sleep be deep, may your awakening be gentle, and when you walk again beneath the sun, may you carry with you some of the dark wisdom that is only learned in the hours between midnight and dawn, the hours when the Watchers still look down, when the forgotten women are finally remembered, and when all of us, for a moment, can glimpse the wings we never knew we had. Wings that might lift us up or cause us to fall, depending on where we choose to fly. Good night and good dreams. The story has ended, but your story is only just beginning.